Section 23 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. The Tenwood Witch. Mr. Ambrose Kay made his living by being born with money, marrying some more, and inheriting the rest. There is no other method of making a living which throws so little strain upon the maker, and if this were more generally adopted, it is probable that much grumbling and discontent would be avoided. Ambrose Kay had a sweet and gentle disposition, never having felt any strain of any kind. He never grumbled about his house in Hill Street, and he was careful not to speak about Tenwood Manor in the county of Sussex at all, because if he had spoken he would have bragged. He thought Tenwood to be in every respect perfection, in spite of its gruesome tradition. He loved the place. He was always rather formal, and at the age of 40 his round eyes peered through gold-rimmed glasses, and his speech was slow and precise. Strangers were generally a little surprised when they found that he was a good sportsman, of an old-fashioned type. He had married at 25 a good-natured tomboy of a girl 7 years younger than himself, and the marriage had been eminently happy. But no man is so happily placed that he may avoid all anxieties, and Ambrose Kay had his share of them. There was, for instance, the time when his hair was getting thin on the top. There was a long period of struggle. Specialists were called in. Flagrant and impossible quacks were not disdained. One remedy followed another. There were gleams of hope occasionally in a night of despair, times when he would come down to breakfast and tell his wife that he thought he had really hit on the right stuff at last. But one by one the gleams died out, and an inexorable-looking glass assured him that the struggle had gone against him. That anxiety was all over now. James had long ago cleared the majestic array of ineffective bottles from Mr. Kay's dressing-room. Ambrose Kay was quite resigned now, and the crown of his head was completely bald. He was still anxious about his figure. He kept a weighing machine in his dressing-room, and consulted it at regular intervals. And here his war with fortune was more successful. On the days when that stupid machine made insulting disclosures of a gain of flesh, Ambrose Kay became appallingly strenuous. The time which was not given to violent exercise was time lost. At the table he became an ascetic, partaking of specially prepared dishes from which everything at all amusing had been rigorously excluded. And he always triumphed. The weighing machine admitted the loss of the requisite number of pounds, and for a while Ambrose Kay was happy and himself again. But he was still anxious, and at any time it might be necessary to begin the struggle again. But his chief and most persistent anxiety was his only child, Victoria, just 14 at the time of this story. He was most seriously troubled on the subject of her health, which was excellent. He worried continually about her education, and the formation of her character, and the books she read, and the pony she rode. Ordinary parental care would have looked like stark neglect beside the multitudinous solicitudes of Ambrose Kay. Never was any child so hygienically fed and clothed as Victoria, so protected and waddled in cotton wool, so meticulously administered. Few nursemaids had been able to keep up to the high standard that Mr. Kay demanded for Victoria for more than a month or two. The world was ransacked to find a governess of perfection for her. Her pony had been subjected to tests that would have found out the weak points of a canonized saint, and was without doubt the safest pony in Sussex. Victoria surveyed it all with wondering eyes, and called the pony an old sheep. It occurred to many people, Victoria included, that Mr. Kay rather overdid it. "After all," her mother observed, "she's not ill, you know. She's not even delicate." "Possibly not," Mr. Kay admitted. "Possibly not. But there's the nervous constitution to consider. Only today I discovered, fortunately in time, that Mrs. Annersley had given her that book of Hans Andersen's. I will not allow her to hear anything whatever about fairies or ghosts or ogres, or any supernatural nonsense of that kind. That's the way that children are tortured and their nerves ruined for life." "Don't know," said Mrs. K meditatively. "I used to read Hans Andersen, and my nerves have come out of it all right. And the child lives in a haunted house, anyhow." "Please don't revive that old story. We know there's nothing in it, and it's best forgotten." "Well, the Tenwood Witch died here." "Some old woman who was so-called died here, undoubtedly. That is the only scrap of truth in the whole thing. Nothing has ever occurred to make us believe that the house is haunted. The servants talk among themselves at times. Servants will always talk. If any one of them breathes a word on the subject to Victoria, it will mean instant dismissal, and they know it. If there had been anything ghostly to see or hear, you or I would have come across it." "I suppose so. And it's not only Victoria I'm thinking about. You know how nervous Alicia is, and she's sleeping in the haunted room. I mean the room that was once said to be haunted." Alicia was Lady Alicia Medley, a distant cousin of Ambrose Kay's. She was unmarried, 60 years old, melancholy, and gifted with a fine capacity for believing almost anything. She was particularly great at amateur doctoring and dispensing. She never visited Tenwood without discovering that Victoria needed a little something. This time she insisted upon cod-liver oil. Victoria loathed cod-liver oil, and to say that she loved her Aunt Alicia would be a misrepresentation of fact. The only other Christmas guests who had arrived so far were Mr. Annersley and his wife, the lady who had been indiscreet enough to present Victoria with Hans Andersen, and their daughter Judith, a girl of about the same age of Victoria and her dearest and most intimate friend. As the two girls crossed the park that afternoon, Miss Judith Annersley observed that the surrounding scenery was rather decent, and that one ought to have a pretty good time at Tenwood. "Think so, Judy?" said Victoria. "It wouldn't be so rotten if it weren't for the grown-ups." Miss Annersley protested that she had found Mr. and Mrs. K rather decent, in which apparently they resembled the scenery. "Dear Papa's all right," said Victoria, "when I'm handling him alone. He's an awful muff about me, but I can generally work things somehow." "Queer, too," said Judith, "because he's not a muff other ways. I mean to say he's a good shot and all that." "Yes, but he's got me on his mind and on his nerves. And now that he's got Aunt Alicia to back him, it's no joke. Judy, that woman's a holy terror. Cod-liver oil at present, but she's taken the carriage and driven off to the chemist's this afternoon, so goodness knows what it will be next. She says that at this season of the year the young and thoughtless, that's you and me, are apt to try their digestion severely, and it is well to have a few useful correctives on hand. These were her own blessed words. "I say," said Miss Judith Annersley, "couldn't we shunt her?" "Don't I wish we could," said Victoria, with fervour. "She's an utter and complete cat, and I wouldn't much mind what I did. Mind you, you're not safe, Judy. She was on to your mother this morning, saying that you didn't look robust, and she could recommend a tonic. I had that tonic myself last year, and it was enough to poison an elephant." "I don't know why she shouldn't go," said Judith pensively, "and I've got an idea that wouldn't be half bad." They discussed that idea at great length. Lady Alicia Medley looked pale and haggard at breakfast next morning. In answer to kind inquiries from Victoria and her friend Judith, she admitted that she had not slept well. Later in the morning she had a serious interview with Mr. and Mrs. K. "Ethel," said Lady Alicia solemnly, "I'm sorry to have to tell you that I cannot be one of your Christmas party this year. I cannot, in fact, spend one more night under this roof, and I leave by the afternoon train. And if you take my advice, you also will leave this house as soon as may be, and at any cost, and never return to it." "Dear me!" exclaimed Mr. K. "I'm awfully sorry. This is very sudden. What has been happening?" Lady Alicia Medley observed that there were more things in heaven and earth than Ambrose supposed. She had had a strange and awful experience, one which she would never forget, and wished never to go through again. "You don't mean to say that you think you've seen—" "No, Ambrose, I do not think I've seen. I'm not that kind of woman. I have actually seen the historic ghost of this house, the Tenwood Witch, and seen as clearly as I see you now." "This is too extraordinary. Are you sure you didn't dream it?" Mrs. K. asked. "Not being a complete imbecile, Ethel, I know whether I'm awake or not. When this occurrence happened, I was wide awake." "Do tell us about it." Like yourselves, I discredited the story of the Tenwood Witch. I have slept in the haunted room often on previous visits, and have neither seen nor heard anything unusual. I never expected to see anything, and I'm not a nervous woman. If I felt anything approaching to nerves, I should take Thatcher's all-round tonic or some other suitable remedy. I have been told that I am particularly cool and clear-headed, and certainly I am not a person to imagine things. Certainly not. Very well, at 1:45 this morning, I was awakened by an icy breath passing over my face. I looked round and saw that the door of my room was slowly opening. As it opened, the moonlight streamed in from the big window on the other side of the passage, so that I could see distinctly and beyond the possibility of any mistake. And suddenly, there in the doorway, stood the figure of the Tenwood Witch, a bent old woman with a shawl over her head and a cloak that reached to the ground. I could not see the face very well, but in dress and general appearance she closely resembled the portrait of the Tenwood Witch in the county history. Mr. K. made a mental note that Victoria must on no account be allowed to consult the county history. In one hand the figure held a great staff, the twisted bough of some tree, and with this it made threatening gestures. When I looked again it had gone, vanished without the faintest sound of a footstep. I waited a little, and then I switched on the light, got up and shut and locked the door. That was all, but it was enough. I am sorry, but I must go. My maid is packing my things at this moment. She feels quite as I do about it. Lady Alicia's account of what had happened was not strictly accurate. I doubt very much if she ever felt that icy breath. Nor was it true that the footsteps were absolutely noiseless. I happen to know that the Tenwood Witch on this occasion was wearing tennis shoes, in order to step as quietly as possible, but she was not absolutely noiseless. Lady Alicia remained obdurate. No persuasions could move her. "No, Ethel," she said, "I'll come and see you in Hill Street with pleasure, but never again in this house. And if you take my advice, you'll sell the place at once." "But she did dream it," said Ambrose Kay to his wife when they were left alone. "Yes, unless someone was playing a practical joke on her." "I don't think it likely. Of course, I don't believe a word of the nonsense any more than you do, but we must take steps at once to prevent any word of this getting to Victoria's ears." "You think Vic would be frightened?" "I can't say. She appears high-spirited, but I am convinced that the nervous constitution is there. Children have been frightened into lunatic asylums by these stupid ghost stories before now. Unfortunately, Alicia told her maid, and there can be no doubt that the maid will have told our own servants. I must see to it immediately." Ambrose Kay developed as much energy as if his weighing machine had recorded a 3-pound increase. Long before Lady Alicia had left the house, every servant in the house knew that if they breathed one word of what had happened to Miss Victoria Kay, their portion would be instant dismissal, with, in all probability, a long term of penal servitude to follow. "Ambrose," said Lady Alicia sternly, just before her departure, "I can see by your manner that you disbelieve me." "Not at all," said Ambrose. "I'm sure you thought you saw what you say. These illusions do sometimes happen, especially when one is not quite awake." "Really, you're extremely trying, Ambrose. I don't have illusions. I saw what was there. I will not run the risk of another similar shock to my nerves." "You could have had any of the other bedrooms, of course. It's only the room you had that is supposed to be haunted. You used to laugh at it. That was before I had this awful experience. Nothing would induce me to spend another night in the house. And in my opinion, you will be acting very wrongly if you do not warn your other guests, and let them visit you later, when you've sold this place and have a decent house where this kind of thing does not happen." "But you know I can't sell this place, even if I wanted to. It's to go to Victoria. And if I warned people about a ghost, they'd either laugh at me or think I was making excuses because I didn't want them. Well, I have done my duty. I have warned the Annersleys, and I am sorry to say that they treated the matter in a very flippant and frivolous manner. Possibly by this time tomorrow they will be sorry they did not leave when I did. You may be sorry also." As Ambrose Kay watched the carriage vanish down the drive, he did not feel absolutely heartbroken at the loss. They had done their duty in asking her. But she was rather a lugubrious old lady, and she did not add to the enjoyment of a Christmas house party. Besides, he felt a little doubtful about Lady Alicia's indiscriminate prescriptions. If Victoria needed medicine, would it not after all be as well that the medicine should be given by a regular doctor? And, finally, he was annoyed with her for her attempt to detach the Annersleys. She was of the family, and could come and go as she pleased, or as her nightmares might happen to move her. But what right had she to try to spoil his Christmas house party? An idea occurred to him. If Lady Alicia had told the Annersleys all about it, it was just possible that they might be mad enough to speak of it in the presence of Victoria. Obviously, it was of no use to muzzle the servants if the visitors were free to do the harm. He could picture Victoria in a madhouse, her nervous constitution wrecked from the terror inspired by indiscreet revelations of the spirit world. He sought for Mrs. Annersley at once. She treated the matter as a joke, but was quite willing to promise to say nothing to Victoria about it. Still, she added, why not let her share the fun? I told Judith, and she doesn't seem much upset by it. Ah, but possibly Judith has not Victoria's nervous constitution, and children often suffer terribly from these things when they're too proud to admit it. Dear me, there's Judith in the garden with Victoria. If you don't mind, I think I'll just say a word to her. He went down and secured Judith. I say, my dear, I believe you've heard why Lady Alicia left so suddenly. Now, of course, I know that she never saw any ghost at all. So do I, said Judith. Sensible girl. There are no such things as ghosts. Still, it might be as well not to tell Victoria. She is not quite so strong-minded as you are. She has a nervous constitution. A thing like this might keep her awake at night, so don't tell her why Lady Alicia left. All right, said Judith seriously. I won't tell her. And then, quite suddenly and unexpectedly, she broke into a wild burst of uncontrollable laughter. She apologized breathlessly as soon as she could speak, and explained that her father and mother had made fun of it. She supposed that was why she had laughed. I see, said Mr. K., but he shook his head seriously. I assure you, he told his wife afterwards, that the child, Judith Annersley, was on the verge of hysteria. Of course she would not confess that she was frightened, and tried to make me believe that she was rather amused than not. But I could see very well that she was not herself. I'm really sorry we ever asked that old cat here at all. Why should everybody suffer because she happens to have a nightmare? It's too bad. Thank heaven Victoria will never hear anything about it. I've guarded against that. His weighing machine that night guaranteed a loss of several ounces. From one point of view this was satisfactory. It illustrated, as he observed, the power of mind over matter, and the effects of worry on the general physique. Judith and Victoria spent a happy afternoon. Their conversation was interrupted at intervals by bursts of laughter that left them helpless and speechless. And to think, Judy, said Victoria, that I nearly missed it altogether. I'd made up my mind to go at 12 o'clock, because that's the proper time for ghosts and hobgoblins. But I didn't wait till nearly 2. I'd half a mind to chuck it until tonight, but then I thought I'd take my chance. It would have been better just at midnight, but I guessed it would scare her any time. So I slipped on my toggery and slithered down the tower stairs in my tennis shoes. She never said a word. Oh, that was all right. That was quite absolutely right. And there was a good 5-shilling bottle of cod liver oil at the bottom of the fish pond. Her parting present to me, said Judith, was a large tin of eupeptic tablets. I was to take one after every meal, or 2 if I had any feeling of constriction. What's that? Blessed if I know. What have you done with them? I gave a big handful of them to your old pony. What a pig you are, Judy. You oughtn't to have done that. That's all right. He wouldn't look at them, so I buried them all. Do you know what I'm going to do? Asked Victoria. I'm going to ask Papa to give me the haunted room. It's much nicer than the room I've got. It's bigger, and it's got lots of cupboards, and it's paneled. He won't do it. Yes, he will. He doesn't believe in the witch business himself, and he'll always do anything I want, unless he can argue that it's bad for me. The worst of it is that I'll have to tell him about this little spree of ours one of these days. I shouldn't. Why? Don't know. I've got to tell the poor old dear everything that I can tell him. I can't tell him that I rode his hunter the other morning, because if I did, he'd sack every man and boy in the stables, and it's not their fault, because I persuaded them. But I'll tell him about the Tenwood Witch. I shouldn't wonder if it amused him. I fancy he's not too keen about Aunt Alicia himself. Besides, it's Christmas time, and nobody can make much of a row about anything at Christmas time." Victoria kept her word. She told her father the whole story. He said that she had been very wrong, and she must promise never to do it again. She promised at once. It was, he reminded her, the duty of children to show a proper respect for their aunts. "Even if they give you pills?" suggested Victoria. Besides, her father urged, these practical jokes were very dangerous. Victoria herself apparently had not got a nervous constitution, but Aunt Alicia had. It was entirely due to Victoria's wickedness that Aunt Alicia was not with them and sharing in the Christmas festivities. At this point, a slight spasm crossed over her father's face. The spasm became a smile, and the smile became a laugh. It may be presumed that she was forgiven, for at present she occupies the haunted room, and at an impromptu fancy dress dance that Christmas she had considerable success as the Tenwood Witch. End of section 23.
Section 24 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. Section 24. Lovers on an Island. 1. "How sweet it would be," said Isabel, "to remain here forever in this lovely little island in the middle of the big, lonely lake, just you and I, Willie." "Table d'hotel at 7:30, said William gloomily. "And we've got to get back for it. And then we shan't get another moment alone together till after 9. And even then we shan't unless we wander off into the garden together, and the last time we did that we were accused of selfishness. We're all right, but I can't make out what the rest of the world was made for." Truly it was an enchanting island, with tall trees where the heron built, and grey, moss-grown boulder where shy, rare lizard sunned themselves, and stretched on bracken. Here for a brief hour they had been quite out of the world, but it was 5 o'clock, and it would take them nearly 2 hours to get back to the hateful civilization, and hateful civilization demanded them acidly and peremptorily. "Listen," said Isabel, "to the little wavelet talking nonsense all around the coast, making love to the silence. Oh, this fragment of pure, sequestered nature, nature as sweet as she always is when she is left to herself." "And we're going back," said William, "to that inferior pot-house masquerading as a first-class hotel under the guidance of an intelligent Swiss. Back to the soul that is really place, and to the creme of volaille, with a quadrupedal origin, and to the lamb that is frozen, and the peas that are tinned, and at the next table will be the reverend father with the indigestion, and the mature lady with the conversation, and the satisfied American who tells us what he will do with this country when he has bought it." "I don't like the people," said Isabel, "and Mama doesn't like them either, and the dinner isn't really as good as it looks and sounds. But all the same, you think too much about food. You're too material." "I'm particularly spiritual by nature," said William modestly, "but at dinner food is rather thrust on your attention, and I have an honest man's hatred of imitations. Otherwise, my wants are few. A loaf of bread, a jug, or just the ordinary bottle of wine, and thou beside me singing in the wilderness, and nobody need trouble about me further. In fact, I wouldn't insist on the bread. It's... Good heavens!" They had just come around the corner to the landing stage, and in one flash of an eye William had realized that the boat in which he had rowed Isabel across to the island was no longer there. "The boat's got away!" cried Isabel in anguish. "So I was observing, and I'm afraid it's my fault. I can't make it out, for the knot that I tied can't slip or go wrong. The harder the boat pulled, the tighter the knot would get. If there were or had been anyone on the island besides ourselves, I should say that someone had been having a little game with us. Oh, Willie, I've remembered. Can you forgive me? Not at present, because I've got nothing to forgive. But if you'll provide the material... It was my fault, all my fault. It was while you were struggling with our fire to boil the kettle. I slipped back to the boat to get my parasol, and it was right on the other end of the boat, and I untied it to pull it round, and then I tied it up again, and I suppose that was it. That's all right, said William. But what will everybody think, and what will they do? Well, with our customary secretiveness, we never said where we were going. They know that we took the tea basket and a rug. He had been carrying these, and he now put them down, and that's all they know. We might be up on one of the many noble mountains that give this desolate country its attraction for the tourists. We might be over at the ruined abbey. The lake is 3 miles away from the hotel, and may never occur to them at all. About 8:30 or 9, they will begin search partying, but they won't have the faintest idea where to search. If we had hired the boat, the man who led it could have been depended upon to rescue us. But this is Jefferson's private boat, which he gave me the use of, and I doubt very much if anybody saw us unlock the boathouse and get it out. If we'd been trying to steal the boat, we should have had some of his men round us in no time. So, taking one consideration with another, we shall certainly be rescued, but quite possibly it won't be till tomorrow morning. It's perfectly awful, but I'm quite sure someone will come for us long before that. Don't look so downhearted, Willie. It will only mean that your dear dinner will be put off for an hour or two. I don't mind it a bit. It's rather adventurous and romantic. Yes, but there's just a chance that it will be beastly uncomfortable for you if we have to stop here all night. That's what I don't like. We aren't going to stop here. Some other boat will come over. Bit late in the day for it. Well, something's certain to happen. It always does on desert islands. Now, what ought we to do? I'm told there's a lot of queer cross currents in the lake, and it's quite possible our boat may have drifted in again. We'll just go round the island and look. I'll go alone if you're tired. Not a bit. I'll go one way and you'll go the other, and we'll meet. Then we shall do it in half the time. The entire circuit of the island could be made in 20 minutes, and they had in all probability many vacant hours before them. But there is a joy in saving time even when it is a very little time and you have no particular use for it. Whole gentlemen of an obese habit will run to catch a train on the underground when there's another in 3 minutes, and then there are inquests. So William and Isobel encircled the island, but they found no trace whatever of their boat. Isobel said that she had been quite sure from the start that that would never do. And now, she said, I know what. Well, what is it? We must try smoke signals. They often used it in the natives, you know. Natives? Of where? How should I know? Just plain natives you get in travel books. I see, said William gravely, and then they set to work collecting bracken for the smoke signal. One of Jefferson's gardeners was to see it, answer it, and start to the rescue at once. Of that Isobel felt quite sure. In the meantime, her word travel books had started her on a train of thought as she gathered the bracken. Willie, dearest, she said suddenly, we ought to have a barrel of pickled pork, very little injured by the sea water. People always have that on desert islands. They do, said William. It is washed up from the wreck. They've lost their parents in the wreck, but they don't think nearly so much about losing their parents as about finding that barrel. However, it's no good complaining. We've got no pickled pork and no sea water to damage it with. We've got no wreck, said Isobel. That's the initial mistake. When you're cast upon a desert island, you have the wrecked vessel fixed firmly on the adjacent coral reef. That is so in the storybooks, and it comes in very usefully, for that wreck does not stop at pickled pork. Anything you want, from a steam crane to a toothpick, is washed out from the captain's cabin and delivered safely on the beach at your feet next morning. Yes, I know that wreck. It's a gratis Whiteley with the tide as the vans. I don't know that I don't miss the patent desert island animal even more. You know those animals, they're wild, but not so very wild. When George or any of the desert island family gets hold of them, they become rapidly docile. George finds an hippopotamus and treats it kindly. Next day, it is still a little shy, but by the end of the week, George is driving it in tandem in a curricle, washed up from the wreck, of course, with an iguana as leader. What's an iguana? Haven't the faintest idea, but I'm pretty certain I've come across it in the desert island stories. We've got nothing of the kind here. We haven't even got the deep, dark forest of eucalyptus and opodeldoc, with the monkeys swinging in it, all packed with breadfruit, guava jelly, and ripe bananas. Oh, this is nothing of a desert island, and I don't care how soon we get out of it. Varia immutabilis semper. An hour ago, you didn't care how long we stopped here. Yes, said Isabel, but there's a difference between stopping because you want to stop, and stopping because you can't get away. Here, we must have got enough bracken for a fire by now. William struck a match. The dry fern blazed freely, and a column of smoke went up on the still air. But no answering signal came from the mainland, and gradually they realized that their fire had not been seen, or had not been understood. Isabel strained her eyes to see a boat being rowed towards them, but no boat came. "This begins to be a nuisance," she said impatiently. "It's nearly 7, and I am simply faint with hunger and fatigue." "What a fool I was to let you tire yourself with gathering that bracken," said William. "However, I'll bring up the rug and the tea basket, and we must do the best we can. Very likely, your smoke signal was seen, and they're on the way to us by now." "On the way to us? They'd have been here by this time. You said yourself we shouldn't get off before tomorrow, and I don't for a moment suppose we shall get off then. It gets frightfully cold at night, too. Never mind, it can't be helped. It was silly of me to let you arrange things, that's all." Decidedly, fatigue, hunger, and disappointment were doing deadly work with Isabel's temper. 2. "Luckily," said William, as he unscrewed the stopper of the bottle, "when one goes on a tea picnic, one always takes far too much milk. That milk will be very useful now. Milk is a food, you know. One doesn't starve when one has milk." "Who says that milk is a food?" "The doctors say so." "Well, I say milk is not a food. Milk's a drink. You drink it, you don't eat it. How can it be a food?" William, good-natured and pusillanimous, said that the doctors were very likely wrong. Doctors often were. "And there's only about a teacup full of it," said Isabel. "I never touch milk myself, except in tea," lied William. "It makes me ill. Lots of men are like that. I'm almost certain I've seen you drink it." "Never! Unfortunately, we used all the tea at tea time. In fact, we seem to have used everything. There are a few biscuits, and any amount of butter." "How many biscuits will there be each?" "Oh, I'm not going to spoil my dinner by eating anything now." "There isn't going to be any dinner," said Isabel in tones of the deepest melancholy. "We shan't get it for 2 or 3 hours, perhaps, but I'm certain we shall get it ultimately. We'll get off this accursed island somehow. Cheer up, Izzy." Isabel did her best to smile faintly. She let herself be persuaded into drinking all of the milk and eating all of the biscuits, and her conscience smote her. She was a very good girl, and as a rule, her conscience had little to do. So on the rare occasions where her conscience did get to work, it did not always work in the most approved manner. Here, for instance, it urged her to prove that she was quite right. "I'm quite sure," she said, "that you think I'm in a horribly bad temper, Willie." William laughed. "Not a bit of it. Naturally, this isn't much fun for you." "I wasn't thinking of myself," said Isabel, with, I fear, a touch of the Christian martyr in her voice. "I was thinking about poor Mama and the others, how terribly anxious they'll be. Have you thought of that?" "Yes, but they won't have begun to be anxious yet. They won't begin to be really troubled before 9. We've been late for dinner before sometimes, you know. Yes, and they've talked to us about it, and we promised that we would never be late again. Well, it's not really our fault this time. We know that, of course, and our own people will know it too, and believe it. But will the rest of the people in the hotel believe it, or will they believe we did it on purpose? It's horrible. It's compromising. We've been engaged a year. We are to be married next month. That doesn't stop people's tongues. There are a lot of ways of stopping people's tongues, said William darkly. By this time, Isabel had quite justified herself in her own mind and believed that she had a legitimate cause for grievance. It's really rather too bad, she said. Naturally, I leave you to manage everything. One always leaves it to the man. Then you bring me on this horrible place, and then you go and lose the boat. And you don't seem to have the faintest idea what to do to get us away again. An emergency like this is a test, and you really don't come out of it very well. It destroys one's confidence. One doesn't feel that one can depend on you to get one through. You can only just stand there and talk. This was severe on the island. It had been a fragment of pure, sequestered nature. It was now a horrible place. It was severe on William, too, for after all it was Isabel, and not he, who had lost the boat. And if he did nothing, it was chiefly because there was nothing to do. Isabel was on the verge of tears, and at her consummate worst. "I'm most awfully sorry," said William. "I know how trying it must be for you. I'll go and get the stuff together for another fire. It will show up better when it is dark." "You can try it, of course," said Isabel resignedly. 3. William went, and at that moment his luck turned right around. At first he could hardly believe his eyes. There was the boat, brought back by the queer currents of the lake, drifting quietly along as if it had never done anything wrong in its life. "Easy," he called. "It's all right. Come along home." She came running towards him. He pointed out the boat. "Return of the Wanderer," he said. "Yes, but it's drifting away from us, and even now it's quite out of reach." "I'm prepared to bet 100 pounds to one hayseed that is not out of my reach," said William. "Please hold my coat for a minute." He waded the first part of the way and swam the rest, and he brought back the boat. As he stood on the shore, panting and wringing the water from his clothes as well as he could, Isabel's conscience smote her once more, and by this time it had got into thorough working order, and smote hard and truly. "Willie, you're soaked, and you'll simply catch your death of cold." "Not I. Rowing will keep me warm. If you'll just catch hold here, I'll fetch the basket and rug." When he came back, he found her repeating with all the solemnity of a litany, "I'm a beast. I am a pig. I won't forgive myself. I'll never, never, never forgive myself." "Hullo!" he exclaimed. "What's all the trouble?" "I'm ashamed of myself. I'm very sorry. You gave me up altogether, if you like. It will only serve me right." "Afraid I can't. Not got time, for one thing. Tumble in, sweetheart. All right, off we go, then." As he pulled her away from the island, she continued, "It was simply splendid, the way you brought that boat in. I never saw anything like it. It was magnificent, and to think that you did it all for the stupid, spitefully cowardly she-cat that I am." "I say don't go on like that," said William, "or you'll make me laugh, and I can't laugh and pull at the same time. To think that I sneered at the intelligent Swiss who runs our hotel. Shan't I fly at this warmed-up garbage as soon as I get a chance? I do wish you hadn't got into the water like that. It won't do me any harm, and it will do us collectively good. It proves that we really did lose the boat. You're an angel." And luck having now decided to take the lovers in hand, did the thing thoroughly well. They tucked the boat up in the little home by the edge of the lake, and took the path up into the main road, and they had hardly reached the road before they heard behind them the sound of a quick trotting horse. "That's Vera!" exclaimed William. Must be, the horse and cart swung around the corner into sight. By Jove, it is! Hi there, Tom! Vera was a fast mare belonging to the proprietor. William always maintained that the intelligent Swiss must have stolen her, on the grounds that the Swiss would never have bought so good an animal, and nobody would have been fool enough to give her to him. The man pulled up, and William helped her into the cart. "You'll be home in a quarter of an hour," he said. "But aren't you coming too?" "Too wet. I'll run for it. I shan't be long after you." On his arrival, he found that she had already established for him a serviceable reputation as a hero and a genius. At the utmost of his exploit was that he had swum a few yards in his clothes and recognized the horse. He felt that he had obtained the reputation at a very moderate cost. The hotel dinner was over, but the intelligent Swiss, susceptible to the beauty of Isobel and the long purse of her father, did wonders. They dined well, under the admiring supervision of Isobel's family. The Swiss produced with an air of mystery a very special bottle. "No," he said to William, "that is not on the wine list. It is not fit that. I have drunk it myself." And Isobel explained to her mother that if you were in a railway collision, a colliery explosion, a shipwreck, and an earthquake simultaneously, you were quite all right as long as you had William with you. "If I'd been with anybody else, I should have been sitting on that darling little island without any dinner at this moment." The length of the swim increased and multiplied exceedingly. By the end of dinner, it was represented that William had swum halfway across the lake. She also proved that, but for William, there would have been no cart to take her swiftly home from the lake. I do not know how she did this, because the cart would have overtaken her in any case, and even if she had not recognized the horse, the man Tom would certainly have recognized her and pulled up. So I do not know how she did it, but she did it, and with such enthusiasm as to convince all who heard her. With the solitary expression of William himself, he protested frequently and firmly, until he found that he was merely earning another reputation for excessive modesty. Then he gave up. But it was pleasant to sun himself in his lady's favor once more. 4. Long after Isobel had gone to bed, William sat in the hotel smoking room, consuming many cigarettes and listening to the converse of an aged angler. Now the angler was a cynic, which is not wonderful. While the angler is not catching fish, that is, for by far the greatest part of the time that he is trying to catch them, he has leisure for meditation, and his meditations are likely to take a bitter tone. But I do not know why all cynics are extremely liable to say things about women. There seems to be no reason for it. The aged angler's principal opponent was the dyspeptic clergyman whom William and Isobel had dignified by the name of Reverend Father. But tonight the Reverend Father had gone to bed early, in a state of harassing doubt as to whether it had been wise of him to take a second helping of ice pudding. Consequently, the aged angler had room to spread himself, and he talked on the subject of woman. "You will never find in any woman," he cried dictatorially, "a really perfect sense of truth and justice. Even the best of them have not got it. The best woman in the world will blame her husband for what is really rank bad luck, and not his fault in the very least. If the train in which they are traveling breaks down, and she has a few hours to wait, she always feels and acts as if her husband was in some way responsible. But then," said William, "she also praises and loves her husband for his good luck, for which also he is not responsible. One injustice cancels the other, and they both go out, and so no harm's done." "You really think like that?" "Certainly. Then all I can say is that you have no proper sense of justice yourself." "Very likely," said William, "and I'll bet you the want of it doesn't keep me awake at night. Good night, everybody." "Of course," said the aged angler when William had gone. "We have to take into account that he's very much engaged to be married. Poor chap." End of section 24.
section 25 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria de Fátima da Silva. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. The Hero and the Burglar. On the 9th day of the honeymoon, being at the time in the presence of his wife, Mr. Herbert Fayle broke a bootlace. And that settled it. From that time forward, onward and upward, through 20 years of happy married life, Mrs. Fayle entertained an immutable opinion of her husband's potential ferocity in direct contradiction to the facts. Her sister, who once ventured to suggest that Herbert was not so very terrible, was treated with superiority. You would naturally think so, Clara. That quiet man of Herbert's is very deceptive. You see, you have never seen Herbert when he is roused. I have. I remember one occasion quite early in our married life when the storm broke. This was the occasion when the bootlace also broke. I assure you I shall never forget it. Mrs. Fayle used Herbert's potential ferocity to overawe her erring servants. This she did with singular persistence, perfect confidence, and no success whatever. If, she would say to a careless housemaid, Mr. Fayle had seen the way the drawing-room was dusted, or rather not dusted, this morning, I tremble to think what might have happened. The servants did not tremble. They knew better. Mrs. Fayle was away once for a month, and her husband was left in the house. During that month the servants had the time of their lives. Mr. Fayle was vaguely conscious that he could never get any hot water, and that there were many horrid irregularities, but the only time it was when dinner was an hour late he had ventured to inquire why. He was told that the dog had got out. This satisfied Mr. Fayle thoroughly, and made him ashamed that he had spoken. The dog got out quite a good deal while Mrs. Fayle was away, and so did the servants. And if one of them, not the dog, missed the last train back, then why, as the cook observed, did those railway companies want to go altering their timetables about? The fact is that in an international competition, Herbert Fayle would have been awarded first prize and champion gold cup for sheer meekness. But his wife's belief in her husband's brutally heroic qualities remained unshaken. The high opinion that so many women have of their husbands frequently has no basis in facts, but it is always touching and sometimes useful. Herbert Fayle lived a peaceful life in a quiescent suburb, and the heroic quality that is never required is never missed. But let us do Mr. Fayle justice. He did protest, with all the strength that congenital meekness would allow, against any excessive estimate of his militant character. "I'm a good-tempered man," he said, and he was. It was only after the incident in which Joshua Bidder was concerned that he gave up the struggle. Joshua Bidder was a burglar and a disgrace to his profession. He knew nothing, he could do nothing, he was intemperate, and he had nerves. He was unskillful and unfortunate. He had frequently been in prison, and he never had anything to show for it. He was despised by his own fraternity. "The only time Bidder ever got anything," said one able and scientific crook, "was once when he broke into a place where they had the mumps." If a job of peculiar softness was to be described, it was said that Josh Bidder himself couldn't hardly miss it. Police court missionaries had done their best with Bidder, and so had the Salvation Army, but nobody was more eager to get Joshua to stop it than the old established burglars were. It was not merely that he brought the profession into contempt. His bungling often gave warning and spoiled the chance. "Look here, Josh Bearder," said an elderly expert, at the present moment eligible for entertainment at the state's expense. "If ever I catches you trying anything as I've a mind to touch myself, I'll just put your lights out. You turn your attention to sneaking milk cans on a foggy morning. That's all you're fit for." Failure and ignominy having driven him from the metropolis, Mr. Bidder went to the suburbs. Here he hung about and peeped over walls and attracted the notice and suspicion of the local police. His face alone was almost enough to justify arrest. Dogs would go 2 miles out of their way to bite Bidder, and do it cheerfully. The most credulous of maidservants at the back door refused to believe his preposterous statement that he was a traveling photographer, and unchained the dachshund. When Joshua Bidder decided that on the night of August the 2nd he would enter and ransack the residence of Herbert Fail, it might have seemed to the careless observer that he had at last struck the line of least resistance. But a judicious burglar would have discovered that the Fails were leaving for their holiday on the following day, and that on the afternoon of August the 2nd their plate and jewels had been safely deposited in the strong room of the local bank. And the judicious burglar does not crack empty nuts. On the evening of August the 2nd, Joshua was in a position of affluence, which was unusual with him, having that morning succeeded in changing a bad half-crown. This being so, Joshua entered a public house and took a light dinner, consisting of a quart of stout with 6 penny worth of gin in it. He felt that this gave him heart for the work before him. It cannot be necessary to add that the judicious burglar does not drink when he is on business, and does not provide evidence by entering public houses. Briefly, he does very few of the things that Joshua did. At 11 o'clock, he entered the garden of the Fails' residence. Standing with his flat feet on a Jacoby geranium, he surveyed the house, and came to the conclusion that everybody was in bed and asleep. If he had walked round to the other side of the house, he would have seen that one room on the first floor was still lit up. But Joshua was not a glutton for physical exertion, and he did not walk round. He pushed back the catch of the scullery window, removed his boots, opened the window, and entered. He should not have left his boots in the garden, but the table knife procedure was quite correct. He struck a silent match, and by the light of it made his way into the dining room. That fatal dining room! Many a burglar far abler than Joshua has found in the dining room the graveyard of his reputation. Joshua now switched on the light. He noted with pleasure decanters, a siphon, and glasses. "Anybody would think they were expecting of me," he said to himself, as he poured out half a tumbler of whiskey and took a comfortable chair. He intended to take just that one drink and to come back for the rest after he had made his collection. But in 5 minutes he was fast asleep. In his study upstairs, Mr. Herbert Fail had heard nothing of Joshua's entrance. Fail was a tidy man, and he was arranging and putting away his papers preparatory to his departure on the morrow. This being done, he felt thirsty and decided to go down to the dining room for a whiskey and soda. Reprehensible conduct of this kind was very unusual with Mr. Fail. He noticed the light under the dining room door and made a mental memorandum to ask Mary to speak to the servants about their carelessness. Then he opened the door, and his heart sank within him. The sleeping Joshua was a horrifying and repulsive blackguard. Herbert Fayle decided that his right course would be to close the dining room door as softly as possible so as not to wake the burglar, and then to fetch one or more policemen. But at that moment Joshua suddenly awoke, realized Herbert Fayle, and staggered to his feet. Joshua was not, speaking pedantically, sober, but he pulled himself together as well as he could, and embarked hurriedly on a story which he believed to be plausible. "Sorry, governor," said Joshua. "My mistake entirely. I've been dining with a few gentlemen friends, little girl's birthday, and lost me way home. What I expect is I put the wrong latchkey in my pocket and the train took me past my right station. And..." Joshua stopped short. He had suddenly grasped an important fact, that the other man was much more frightened than he was. In two lurches he put himself between Mr. Fayle and the door, and changed his manner. "Hand over your ticket and your cash, or I'll cut your liver out," said Joshua fiercely, producing his table knife. Mr. Fayle retreated, with one hand grasping his watch pocket, and with 4 pence and a bunch of keys jingling alluringly in his trousers pocket, took up a strong position behind the dining room table and said, "Now, steady now, steady now, steady now. Really now, steady now." Joshua brandished his knife and overbalanced himself. He clutched at things in general and brought the tray of whiskey and glassware to the ground, with himself on the top of it. His uninviting face was cut considerably, and the noise was such that it woke the sleeping Pomeranian in its basket on the second-floor landing.
"Yup, yup, 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 yup,"
said the Pom. Its varied excursions had been useful to the servants, and now it was rendering splendid service to Mr. Fayle himself. The dog is a friend of man. Joshua Bidder, picking himself up from the ruins, heard the dog
and
recognized the force of its argument. He had been bitten before, and now, in the presence of any dog, his backbone turned to water. He had just time for a little parting sarcasm as he made for the window. "So long, old pal," said Joshua. "Sorry I can't stop. Remember me to the missus." He flung up the window and stepped out onto the drive. As he did so, a large black thing jumped out of darkness and collared Joshua by the neck and the left wrist. And the bass voice of the large black policeman said, "Here! Where do you think you're coming to?" "For cop," said Joshua humbly. Inside the dining room, Mr. Herbert Fayle heard the comforting voice of the policeman and saw in a flash that pursuit was now deprived of any attendant disadvantages. So he went in pursuit at once, and the way he came through that window with the poker clasped in one hand was perfectly glorious. "It's all right, sir," the policeman called as he clicked the handcuffs on Joshua's wrists. "It's all right. I've got him here." He flashed his bullseye over Joshua's lacerated visage. "My word, sir, but you've given him what for, and no mistake." "Bit of a rough and tumble," said Mr. Fayle complacently. "Lucky for him I got him before you come up with that poker. You'd have a done for him, sir." "I've been cruelly mishandled," whined Joshua. "If there ain't one law for the rich and another for the poor, he should be made to answer for." "Hold your jaw," said the policeman unfeelingly. And then Mrs. Fayle and the dog arrived on the scene, the former in a dressing gown and both agitated. Mrs. Fayle clung to her husband, and the dog clung by its teeth to Joshua. the dog being removed, explanations followed. Mrs. Fale's account of the incident was based partly on the policeman's account. Mr. Fale gave him a sovereign afterwards, and I think the man had earned it, and partly on Joshua's account, and partly on feminine intuition. With a view to a possible mitigation of his sentence, Joshua continued to maintain that he had been grievously assaulted. Mrs. Fale could get very little out of her husband, and he shirked questions, but that was quite easy to understand. These brave men are often so modest and reticent about what they have done. "Fortunately," said Mrs. Fale to her sister Clara, "the Dobsons' gardener saw the man as he entered, thought he seemed a very suspicious character, and just mentioned it to the next policeman he met. The policeman found the man's boots under the open scullery window, and lay in wait for him. And if he had not been there, Herbert would have killed that man, killed him." "Would he really?" said Clara. "The policeman and the burglar both thought so, and they knew. Herbert makes light of it, but then that is his way. I must tell you, he entered the dining room without a suspicion there was anything wrong, and there was that awful man crouching with a knife in his hand ready to spring on him. Herbert was unarmed, and as you know, he is not a big man, not nearly as big as the burglar was. Without an instant's hesitation, he picked up a heavy decanter and felled the man to the ground with it. Then there was a most awful struggle between them. At last the burglar managed to break away and got through the window. Herbert snatched up a poker and dashed after him. As I say, it is a mercy the policeman was there. The people who have never seen Herbert when he is roused simply do not know him." Herbert protests mildly that his wife exaggerates, but he would sooner wear the halo of the hero than give the exact version of what happened between him and Mr. Bidder. End of section 25.
Section 26 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. Appreciation. Once upon a time, or even oftener, there was a desert. If you should ever want to make a desert, this is the best way. Take 1,000 good square miles and spread thickly with sand. Throw in 2 oases, a nice fresh mirage, a dead camel, and 3 live Arabs, and serve very hot. But this particular desert was not made. It came so. It had always been like that. But I am sorry to say that it had not got the 3 live Arabs. Its oases were rich, its mirage was in perfect working order. The sand was spread very thickly indeed, and the camel was just about as dead as any reasonable camel could expect to be. But there were no live Arabs. In fact, in the whole of that vast desert, there was no living thing of any kind. Don't begin to blame the desert now. It knew perfectly well that it was defective, and felt it very deeply. A desert does not expect to be densely populated, but it wants some living things of some kind. A couple of jackals and a mosquito would have made this desert quite happy, and it had done its very best to attract visitors. Here, for instance, is an advertisement which it inserted in Bills and Clauses, which I need hardly tell you is the principal political newspaper circulated among the birds. To vultures commencing. Before building elsewhere, apply to Box 1460 at the office of this paper. Useful climate, good water, and large free camel. Sandstorms twice daily during the season. A fine sunset performs every evening. Now if you read that carefully, you will see that it was a very nicely worded advertisement. Of course, by useful climate, it meant unhealthful climate. But neither a climate nor a sandstorm can kill a breakfast for a vulture unless there is something to kill. Also, only one camel was mentioned. Those were weak points, and I expect that the vultures noticed them. For not one single reply to its advertisement did the desert get. I doubt if there is any bird that gets more real aesthetic enjoyment out of a good sunset than a vulture does. But if it gets no food, it is the habit of the vulture to die. And when a vulture is dead, its enjoyment of things becomes considerably lessened. In desperation, the desert put another advertisement in under the stripes, which, as you are probably aware, is the leading society journal read by tigers. And this next advertisement I cannot defend at all. It was deliberately untruthful. It makes it impossible to be sorry for the desert for what happened afterwards. It ran as follows. To man-eaters. Oasis to let in a salubrious desert. Nice position. Well-stocked caravans pass the door weekly. Good living for an energetic couple. Magnificent sunsets night and morning. This was all very wrong. The desert was not salubrious. No caravan ever came near it, and though the sunset was magnificent, it was engaged for evening performances exclusively. A tiger will always walk 20 miles to see a really enjoyable sunset, and one came to the desert to investigate. He arrived in the morning and asked to see the sunset. The desert said it was just over. Then he asked to see the tracks of the caravans, and the desert explained that this kind of caravan didn't leave any tracks. The desert showed the tiger into the best oasis in the place, but he grumbled and said he couldn't eat cold camel, and the whole thing was a swindle, and he should have his money back. He left at once, and that very day the sunset turned sulky. He said he was absolutely dead sick of giving performances to empty houses. What I should like, he said, would be a few artists sitting round on camp stools. Other sunsets get it. Oh, but not in a place like this, said the desert. We haven't the facilities. Seems to me you haven't got anything except sand. I know sunsets that hadn't got a color scheme that I wouldn't have been ashamed of, and yet they've got into the academy. Last night I brought out an arrangement in crimson and purple, lovely enough to make a company promoter weep, and it was absolutely wasted. It takes all the heart out of one's work. I shall give it up. Pray, don't say that, said the desert excitedly, well knowing that the sunset was its only attraction. You may not be able to get a range of hills to work on, such as we provide, if you go elsewhere, and without a nice low range of hills, you can't get your effects properly. You see, the artists may come yet. You're doing very well, and they're bound to hear of you sooner or later. It wouldn't surprise me if in a month or two's time all this sand here was simply crawling with artists. Wouldn't it? Said the sunset sardonically. Well, it would surprise me. However, I won't make a point of artists, but I do say that I must have an audience of some kind. If I could have a dozen intelligent vultures and a few tigers of taste, I wouldn't leave you. There was a tiger here only this morning. Then why didn't you keep him? You know that I never give matinees. Now listen to me. I've got something specially fine for tonight. It's an opal and gold and gray with quick changes. It's quite the finest thing I've ever done. It ought to last for about an hour. If you can't find some living thing to see it and love it and nearly cry over it, you'll get no more performances out of me. That's definite and final. That night the desert was illumined with the finest sunset that there has ever been since the world began. But no one saw it, and all its gentle miracles of beauty were like a lovely voice singing in an empty house. Next day there was no sunset, and in its despair the desert gave up being a desert altogether. The sand was sold by auction to different seaside resorts to make beaches with, and I don't know what became of the dead camel and the other things. But the desert had to begin life all over again as a corkscrew, and how it became a corkscrew it would take too long to tell here. Besides, I can imagine that you are already impatient to get to the moral. And this moral you shall remember whenever you read a book or look at a picture or listen to music. It is this. Without appreciation there is no performance. Or if you would like it put differently, in the genesis of a work of art, its creator is its father, but it has many mothers, those that understand it, and without them it could not exist. It is quite true that you have helped to make every story, every music, and every picture that you have liked intensely, but you will never get paid for it. End of section 26.
Section 27 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. The Philosopher. There was once a man who obtained at an early age the reputation of a philosopher. He had an impressive way of telling people that things were not what they seemed, and of proving that any conclusion at which they had naturally arrived must ipso facto be wrong. One summer's day, as he strolled through the fields, he found a maiden stretched in the shade of the trees, face downward, weeping bitterly. "Maiden," he said, "tell me why you weep. For I am a philosopher, and haply I may be able to administer to you words of salutary consolation." At this the maiden sat up and showed her face, and behold, her face was as plain as a motor omnibus, and with much emotion the end of her snowy nose had become rosy and phosphorescent. "Oh, sir," said the maiden, "I weep because the gods have given everything to my sister Lesbia, and to me nothing at all." Then the philosopher sat down beside her. "Let us first see," he said, "if the facts are as you state them, for it happens not infrequently that things are not what they seem. What is it then that the gods have given to your sister and not to you?" "Beauty," said the girl, "and beauty is everything. Lesbia is the loveliest creature in the world. Her chestnut hair is so long, so profuse, so delightful in its waves, and she gains an honorable subsistence by exhibiting it in a shop window as an advertisement for a hair tonic. Her eyes are gray and long lashed and heavenly. She is a little pale, but it becomes her, and her fragrant lips are scarlet." "Dear me," said the philosopher, "but it happens at times that with the beautiful face there goes an uncomely figure." "It is not so with Lesbia. Every curve of her body is a poem. She is full of grace. Artists rave about her, and I, alas! I have no beauty of any kind." And once more the maiden fell a weeping. "Stop that," said the philosopher sternly. "You weep without reason. Would you rather have a gift that you can keep or a gift that is taken from you?" "Certainly, a gift that I can keep. Who would not?" "Very well, then. The gift of the gods to your sister is illusionary. It is no gift, for it will be taken away again. The years will rob her of her beauty. Old age will wither and twist and bend her body. Now then, can you make the omelette aux fines herbes?" "I can," said the girl, but with no pride in it. "In 40 years you will still be able to make the omelette aux fines herbes. That is a gift which brings comfort, and in consequence gratitude and popularity, and it does not fade. are you, perhaps, fonder of reading than your sister is? Lesbia does not care for it. I, on the other hand, have a library subscription at the cash chemist's." "There you are," said the philosopher triumphantly. "You are in commune with the greatest minds of all ages. You have the power of culture. It is undying. It is the finest solace. Now, with regard to the sewing machine." "I've got one, and use it. Lesbia won't touch it. More and more your gifts are being revealed, and they are all of the precious character, far better than your sister's fleeting and worthless beauty. Never say again that the gods have neglected you. Weep no more. You have all for which a wise man looks in the partner of his life." And then the philosopher saluted and left her, and the girl rose to her feet and began to feel more pleased with herself. But presently she was conscious that the philosopher had turned back towards her with a notebook open in his hands. "Beg pardon," he said, a little sheepishly, "but what did you say was your sister's address?" End of section 27. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Section 28 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. The Life of a Bubble. The small girl came out of the house with a well-founded idea that the people inside did not particularly want her. She had also with her a bowl of soap suds and a pipe wherewith to blow bubbles, for solitude must have its solace. She was plain but obedient, good but gooseberry-eyed. She found a clear ring in the middle of the orchard. The grass grew long there. The sense of remoteness was in the air. It was desperately wild and fine. There she sat down and began bubble blowing. The first 2 attempts failed. The third was magnificent. She gave a little shake to the pipe, and the beautiful iridescent globe mounted slowly in the perfectly still air. "That," said the small girl, "is a ripper." The point of view of the human being who regards the bubble and the point of view of the bubble as it regards the human being present certain well-defined differences in matters of detail. "I have been since the beginning of the universe," said the bubble to itself. "I exist now, I shall exist forever. This present experience comes back to me as something imperfectly remembered from very long ago. It is unpleasant. To be so near a material earth, nearer perhaps than I have ever been before, is a kind of contamination. It seems to throw a film of corruption over one. Luckily, the feeling passes. The material earth sinks slowly back into the abyss from which it has risen, while I remain stationary and permanent." The gooseberry eyes of the plain little girl watched the bubble very intently. How slowly it rose! Would it clear that branch? Oh, for a breath of wind to toss it high up, that it might sail far away out of her sight and that she might not witness its breaking! "Yes," said the bubble, "it is so. I observe even now that my unpleasant environment is fading away from me. The girl with the gooseberry eyes, and the indifferent cracked bowl of an advertised soap, and the vast masses of uninteresting green leaves, are sinking slowly back into their abyss. Material influences begin to lose their hold upon me. I am now almost as fine and spiritual as I have ever been. The only thing that really troubles me is that I cannot probe the mystery. Have small, plain girls a use in being? Is there any purpose or design about those vast masses of green leaves? Is soap, however advertised and however perfumed, part of any great scheme tending ultimately to the help and the progress of myself or of my brothers?" The plain girl listened intently. She thought she heard a voice. She would have obeyed the call, for she would have obeyed anything. She had been brought up to it. She had a dim and rather dismal conviction that, when she went in, it was necessary to send her out again, but that if, of her own volition, she went out, it then became necessary to fetch her in. These were things beyond argument, things that belonged to the great powers, that is to say, to the people in the house. But she had heard nothing. It was a mistake, she was not to be fetched in just yet, so she could go on watching. The smoke from the chimneys came sluggishly up through the oily air under a hot leaden sky. The bubble was far away, just above the smoke, not yet out of sight. "Yes," said the bubble, "I do feel distinctly better. That nauseating sense of grossness which was caused by proximity to material things is completely passing away. But ought one to be nauseated? Would not one be happier if one could believe that such things did not exist at all, that they were merely subjective, the bad dreams to which a bubble may now and then be liable? In any case, they pass as a dream. An all-merciful destiny that designed the universe for the use of bubbles arranged that all right." The burning sun of noon stole out from the leaden clouds. Its glory fell full upon the bubble. A drop or two of soapy water flicked the tail of a sparrow flying below it. "It's burst!" cried the girl, in a sad ecstasy. A voice came from the outer and more civilized portion of the orchard. "Where are you, Miss Jane? You come in this minute. Always where you oughtn't to be, aren't you?" The girl who was always where she ought not to be went in that minute. In the meantime, the bubble took an entirely different view of the situation. The poor thing had not the remotest idea that it had burst. "Yes," it said, "it's quite all over now. I am perfectly myself again, back in the calm, distant ether which suits me best. More than ever I incline to the happy view. The things that troubled me, the girl and the soap and the trees, were nothing but an imagining." End of section 28. Recording by Foon. Section 29 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Foon. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. For value received. Custom had overcome natural antipathies, and all three rested in peace on the hearthrug, the bull terrier, the smoke grey cat, and the mean-eyed guinea pig. "That's my tail you're sitting on," said the cat, rather sharply. "Sorry," said the bull terrier, and edged away a little. The guinea pig gave one quick furtive look at the both of them, and then shut his eyes. "Yes," said the smoke grey cat. "I need rest. I've been petted all the morning. You can have no notion what it is to be loved as much as I am." "Really," said the bull terrier. "Well, I don't know about that. Of course, you are very much admired for your soft fluff and your graceful attitudes, but admiration is not love. One cannot get love that way." "How do you get it then?" asked the cat, a little spitefully. "I suppose you do get it from the way you talk." "Love," said the bull terrier, "is the reward of the more solid qualities. Let us suppose, for instance, that a young and beautiful girl goes out for a walk by herself in a lonely country. If she is accompanied by a dog of a good fighting breed, she feels absolutely safe. Therefore, she gets to love that dog. She must do it. It is logically inevitable. And that kind of love lasts when the love of mere beauty fades." "You believe all that?" asked the cat. "It certainly ought to be so," said the bull terrier. "But if I am to be frank, I do not think that our mistress loves me the best." "Now you're talking sense," said the cat. "Nor does she love you the best," added the bull terrier. "I must admit," said the cat, "that it has sometimes crossed my mind that she loves George the best." George was the guinea pig. He was plain, even for a guinea pig. He was not well connected, and his moral standard was very low. "That is so," said the bull terrier sorrowfully. "Just wake him up and ask him how he does it." The cat gave George a pat on the head. His mean and vicious eyes opened quickly. He told her to be more careful where she put her feet. "Look here," said the cat. "What do you do to make our mistress love you better than she loves either of us?" "I am," said George. Yes, you are what? Nothing. I merely am. It is enough. You have neither beauty nor grace, said the cat. You have neither strength nor courage, said the dog. But I am, said the guinea pig. That's all that's necessary. Their mistress entered the room. She picked up the guinea pig and kissed him. Then she gently moved the cat and the dog so that George might lie nearer the fire. There was a moment's silence when she had left the room. Then a sound came from the guinea pig which might well have been a chuckle or might have been a snore. The cat went fast asleep out of sheer disgust. The dog sat up and stared into the fire with great solemnity, and blinked and thought. He then made the following observation. The highest price that is paid is never by any chance for value received. End of section 29.
Section 30 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Angelique Campbell, August 2018. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. Omnia Vanitas. With your kind permission, said the minstrel, I will now introduce to your notice my celebrated apologue on the vanity of human wishes. Surely, said the princess, I have seen or heard something of the kind before. Hush, said the minstrel. The least little interruption is enough to put me out. The sensitiveness of a great artist is finer than anything you can imagine. What would you say if I were to be unable to proceed with that apologue? I should forgive you, said the princess simply. I will render forgiveness harder by proceeding with my story. There was once— About what date? Asked the princess. In the days of old, said the minstrel firmly. As usual, said the princess, and a slight shade of disdain crossed her lovely face. We shall never get on if we stop to talk about every little detail like this. There was once, in the days of old, as I have already told you, a man who could have everything that he wanted. Do let me go on, said the princess. And after he had got everything that he wanted, he found that he did not want it at all. So he ended up just as he had begun before he started on the gratification of his wishes. And the moral of this is that all little boys and girls should be content with that station of life into which it hath. Wrong, said the minstrel. Wrong all through. In any case, am I telling the story to you, or are you telling the story to me? A little of each, said the princess. And that, said the minstrel, is one of the things that I particularly dislike. I will be a performer if I may. I will be an audience if I must. But I will not be both at the same time. With these few words of preface, I will now proceed to tell you that there was once in the days of old— That's the third time, said the princess. There was once in the days of old, the minstrel repeated firmly, a man who could have everything that he wanted. At first he did not know that he could have everything he wanted, and so he became an actor. It was not good, but it might have been worse. He might have been a minstrel, suggested the princess. Quite true. It might have been worse, or, as you say, it might have been better. As it was, he was an actor, just a medium mummer with a blue chin and a high opinion of himself, but with no idea of the good fortune that was awaiting him. One day, when he was being congratulated by his friends on his masterly creation of the part of the second footman in the new drama entitled The Wickedest Woman in the Cabaretius, he shrank modestly from the compliments and said he would sooner have won the Battle of Waterloo than have played Hamlet at an almost first-rate suburban theatre. This was the first intimation that he received of his marvelous destiny. The very next day he did win the Battle of Waterloo. Come now, said the princess, come now. You would like to lie down for a little and rest. Then, perhaps, you will be able to think of something which is more in accord with ascertained facts. Did I say that this was an apologue, or did I not? Is an apologue supposed to be a bald record of facts, or is it rather a suitable field in which the fancy may soar? You can't soar in a field, said the princess. You can get buried in one. Try it. No, go on with your story. Very well, said the minstrel. There was once in the days of old— Stop, said the princess, now justly infuriated. Go on from the point where you left off. Very well, said the minstrel gloomily. This man, who won the Battle of Waterloo, was not for long satisfied with that achievement. He enjoyed it thoroughly, but he felt that more might be possible. One day he read Gray's Elegy, and having looked round to be sure that the shorthand reporter was present, he took a nice attitude and said that he would sooner have written that poem than have won the Battle of Waterloo. The very next day he found that he had written Gray's Elegy. The princess groaned. She said faintly that it was of no use talking. I pointed that out some time ago, said the minstrel severely. The man enjoyed being a great poet very much, but he thought of other things which he would also like to be, and he was them. He thought of things that he would like to have, and he had them. The gratification of his wishes never annoyed him at all. He never prayed that he might go back to his simple cottage and his work on the farm. You said he was an actor, snapped the princess. I did. I also said it was an apologue. That's the beauty of an apologue. This man, who wrote Gray's Elegy, was fully satisfied with the fact that he had got everything he wanted, until he suddenly realized that he had reached the end of his abilities, and he could think of nothing else to want. That was terrible. What do you want me to do about it? Asked the princess, sweetly. Nothing, said the minstrel. It is too late to do anything. The man cut his throat and went mad. You got that in the wrong order. No, I haven't. He didn't cut his throat enough. That's what made him mad. It might have happened to anybody. He is now in an asylum, and the moral of it is that we should always want something. I'm glad I never knew that man, said the princess. Madame, said the minstrel, had he known you, he would have still had a want unsupplied. End of section 30. Recording by Angelique Campbell. August 2018. Section 31 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Angelique Campbell, October 2018. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. The Love Philter. Once, in a remote time and place, the materials of the usual novel presented themselves. A man had fallen in love with a woman, and the woman had not in the least fallen in love with the man. So when he, looking particularly handsome, pleaded his cause with her, she said no. Then the young man communed with himself. He had read in the learned books that women are by nature coy, and that their no, not infrequently, meant yes. So he waited 3 months, then again entreated, and again she refused. Further meditation showed him that it was absolutely essential that he should marry this woman. It was impossible to live without her. If the gods gave him all else and denied him that, then there would be no pleasure in any of their gifts. This being so, he thought of ways and methods by which a woman might be attracted. The first that he tried was brilliance and martial achievements. At that remote period, there was always a war handy for those who wished to distinguish themselves in this way, and the man went into the war. After long waiting, he got his opportunity and came out of it unscathed and with a magnificent record for courage and skill and endurance.
Adorned with the equivalent of the Victoria Cross prevalent at that time, he returned to the house of his lady love, and she would not see him. He was equally unsuccessful when he held out to her the allurements of power. All his wealth and all his long trains of slaves impressed her not at all. He bored her very badly. Then, in despair, and no longer trusting to his own resources, he determined to take counsel of a wise woman that lived 7 days' journey away. He went on his pilgrimage on foot, and because he could not sleep nor weary himself, he made the journey in 4 days. The wise woman was old and gray, and sat huddled up in an untidy parcel. When she saw him approaching, she stretched out a lean hand. "I know," she said, "for what you have come. You desire the lady of your love." "Yes," he answered, "I desire that and nothing else. I desire that at any price. What would you have me do? What would you have me give you?" Then he showed her the equivalent of his bank book prevalent at that time, and she went over it with care. But she said she would take everything, all that he had, all his treasure, all his slaves, and in return she would give him a love philter. Then he most cheerfully made over to her, by the equivalent of a gift of deed prevalent at that time, the whole of his possessions, and she placed in his hands a cup of green jade containing a liquid that was as clear as water, and that shone in the dark as though it had been fire. "See," she said, "that the lady of your love drinks of this. Then she will love you, you only, you with her whole heart, you forever." Then he began his journey home again, and by this time he was fain to sleep and weary in all his limbs. But for his great longing to win the love of the woman, he still went on by night and day, and as he traveled by night, the liquid in the green jade cup gave him light to guide his footsteps. But at the last, sleep would no longer be denied. He stretched himself on the sand a whole hour, with the cup of green jade standing at his head. And as he slept, the only person that ever came into his dreams came into them once more, the woman whom he loved. And in the dream she said to him, "You are coming to see me." He answered, "Yes, and now at last have I the means to overcome your hatred to me, and to turn it into such love as I myself have for you, and ever shall have." She then said, "You have been to the wise woman, and you have bought from her a love philter that she alone can make." "Yes," he said, "for the liquid gleaming like fire in its cup I have given all my possessions. Do you doubt its power?" "No," she answered, "I doubt it not. If I drink thereof, I shall love you forever. Only it will not be I, and it will not be you." "I do not understand," he said. "If I love you not now, and love you after I have drunk of this cup, then it is because the philter, and not you, has made the change in me. It is a trick, a poor deception by which you will try to fool yourself and me." "Then," he said, "better this unhappiness than that unhappiness." And he poured the philter into the sand. And when he awoke, the cup was indeed overturned, and the thirsty sand had drunk the precious liquid to the last drop. So having no longer any hope, he went back on his way home. And as he approached the house where the woman whom he loved lived, she came down the steps towards him, holding out both her hands. "I watched for you from the window," she said. "A few nights ago I dreamed of you, a strange dream. You lay on the sands asleep. I have watched ever since." End of section 31. Recording by Angelique Campbell. October 2018.
Section 32 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria de Fátima da Silva. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. Doing Good. It was a frosty but dull morning. The fields were shrouded in mist, and the garden looked dead and desolate. There was not a breath of wind, not a leaf that danced, not a bough that swayed. Suddenly there was a rattling and whirring in the ivy that half covered the house, and a dozen sparrows flew out, knowing that it was about time for breakfast. They separated and sat on different trees that commanded a view of the windows, and kept a lookout. From time to time they shifted their positions impatiently, but they did nothing practical to accelerate that breakfast. They left that to a bird with more initiative, a bird with a beak and a red breast. The robin came with a dactylic flight down onto the Duke of Connaught immediately in front of the French windows of the dining room, where he could be easily seen by those within. He chose a spray which would bend gracefully beneath his weight and turned his red waistcoat to the window. He looked a perfect Christmas card on that standard rose, and he knew from experience that this was effective. The trick answered once more. A white-haired, genial old gentleman opened the windows and came out. He had a Crown Derby plate in his hands, and the plate was piled high with crumbs. He scattered the crumbs down the gravel walk, and as he did so he said, "Cheer up." He said it several times, and the birds treated it with the contempt it deserved. An old lady looked out of the window and said in a fat and warning voice, "Your hat, Charles." And the old gentleman, reminded that he had nothing on his head, went back into the house again. Then the birds began on the crumbs. The robin came first. He had no more occasion to make play with his red breast. It was his other weapon, his beak, that came in useful now. He took a crumb and pecked a sparrow alternately with great regularity. But he was outnumbered, and, finding the general feeling of the meeting was against him, retired with the biggest crumb. After all, it was better to follow the gardener about and keep near the potting shed during the dinner hour. Gardeners understood the tastes of robins, and did not restrict them to bread. How would the old gentleman have liked it if he had nothing but bread given him for his breakfast? The sparrows were quite contented. They came in from all directions. They flew fearlessly to the crumbs. They hopped cautiously to them, jerking down the garden path with a light run and a quick stop. There were plump sparrows that had been here, bless you, longer than they would care to say, and had had crumbs all the time. There were ragged vagabond sparrows that had dropped in out of nowhere, swearing that they hadn't tasted food for a fortnight. They thieved without shame and were robbed without resentment. One sparrow would select a morsel of bread and hop off with it. The moment he put it down to get work on it, another sparrow who had followed him would snatch it up. "Got him again," the thief remarked with satisfaction. "Plenty more where that came from," replied the philosopher, as he hopped back to the heap of crumbs again. In and out among the brown sparrows went what would have been called in Kensington shops a pretty little article in art shades. It was a little tomtit, with his cap on, making no secret of the fact that he and the peacock both get their clothes from the same place. Far down the path, a fat and timid thrush watched the intrepid and remunerative work of the little birds with plaintive wonder. The old gentleman surveyed the scene from the window for a moment, smiling with pleasure, for he found pleasure in doing good even in the humblest of ways. And at the same time the cat stepped out of the back kitchen into the garden. He was a big cat, white splashed with black, a mighty hunter and a most notorious evil liver. Better to him the mouse or bird that he himself had killed than the cream and chicken of insipid domesticity. He told himself that this weather was the very devil, but for the crumbs and their consequences there would be nothing doing. He preferred the summer, when there were so many young birds and so much cover. He had meant to go to the front lawn and the adjoining paths to see what sport could be got there, and therefore, being a cat, he started off in the opposite direction towards the kitchen garden. That is part of the cat's strategy. He ambled patiently and humbly along as if he had been a tame pony drawing a load of hymn books to oblige a missionary. He paused to look into an empty frame and found nothing there, which was just what he had expected, and then turned his attention to business. In 2 minutes he was on the front lawn, but the birds did not see him because he had hidden himself where the lowest boughs of the big cedar touched the grass. 3 noiseless hops brought the cat in a flash to the box edging of the path where the birds were feeding. He pressed himself close to it and lay motionless but for the extreme tip of his tail, which was rather excited. Then suddenly he began oiling and slithering up towards the birds. Not one hair of his sinful body moved. He made one spring, and he had sparrow for dinner. When you wish to do good, you should first shut up the cat. End of section 32.
Section 33 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. Kind words, said the ant, are worth far more than gold. They give more real pleasure. They do more real good. Try to remember that, Margaret Ursula. Margaret Ursula said she would. She was a good girl, and always tried to do what she was told. She thought about the power and value of kind words while she was undressing that night, and while she was saying her prayers, and while she was falling asleep. And that perhaps is why she had the following extraordinary dream. I tell it as it seemed to her. Margaret Ursula was going down the sunny high street of a quiet provincial town that she knew well. She was conscious that she was very hungry, and that she was interested in what she saw, notably in a cart laden with golden sovereigns and drawn by many horses. The jolting of the cart jerked some of the sovereigns into the gutter. No passer-by took the least notice. Margaret Ursula ran after the cart and called loudly to the driver to stop. He pulled up and stared sullenly. "You've dropped some of your sovereigns," she said. "Run quickly back and get them. I'll hold your horses for you." "Idiot," said the man. "Interfering, fat-headed idiot." "Really?" said Margaret Ursula, much shocked. "That is not a very kind or polite way to speak to a girl who—" "Don't come begging here," said the man sharply. "I've got nothing to give you." She looked amazed. "And don't stand gapping like a dying fish. Anybody to hear you talk would think we lived in the days when this rubbish I'm carting away was worth something. The days before people really knew the value of kind words. So that was it. The world had moved on. Compliments and expressions of sympathy had taken the place of coinage. That did not seem to her to matter much. It came as a thing that she might have expected. What did matter was that feeling of hunger. She was amazingly hungry. She turned from the sullen driver and walked quickly on, looking into the shops as she went. Suddenly she stopped. A faint smell of new bread and chocolate floated out through an open shop door. In the windows were displayed all manner of delightful things to eat. It seemed to her the most glorious and noble confectioner's shop she had ever seen. It was a bad thing, she knew, to enter a confectioner's shop 1 hour before luncheon. But this was such a wonderful shop, and she was so remarkably hungry, that she was tempted to enter. "Wipe your feet, you slut, can't you?" screamed the lady behind the counter, a pretty lady too, and very nicely dressed, but with an angry face. It struck her now that everybody she had met that morning had looked cross and severe. She wiped her feet obediently and said, "My shoes aren't half as dirty as your horrible mat." Margaret Ursula had always been a polite girl, but now she had an overpowering conviction that politeness was extravagance. "Shut up!" shouted the lady behind the counter. Margaret took a large cake and began to eat it. It was pink sugar on the top and chocolate at the bottom. There was cream in the middle, and the rest of it was hot strawberry jam. It was just about the best cake she had ever eaten, but it made her a little thirsty. "Lemonade," she said sharply. The lady behind the counter gave her the lemonade, and at the same time observed that there were some people she disliked on sight. Margaret Ursula drank the lemonade, which was delicious, and carefully refrained from saying "thank you." Now that any polite form of words intended to give pleasure had a purchasing value, one was careful not to use them unnecessarily. The time had now come for Margaret to pay for her refreshments. She turned to the lady behind the counter and said, "I wonder if you would mind my telling you what perfectly beautiful eyes you've got. I shall never forget them." "Go on," said the lady behind the counter. "And there's something in your face that makes me think that at some time you must have gone through a great tragedy." Margaret Ursula knew that almost all women liked to be told that. It seemed to her that these 2 astounding compliments were sufficient payment, and she turned to go. "Come back, you swindler!" shrieked the lady. "You've not paid for your lemonade!" Dear me, what delightful lemonade it was, too! "I think this is the very nicest shop I was ever in. I do hope you will make a great fortune in it." "Thank you," said the lady, and gave one short smile. Margaret realized that she had paid rather too much for the lemonade, and that the thanks and the smile were the change. "And now," the lady continued, "for goodness' sake, get out of my sight!" Margaret Ursula left the shop and entered a hansom. The horse immediately began to kick furiously. His hoofs went rap, rap, rap. "Come in," said Margaret Ursula, rubbing her eyes and yawning, and the maid came in and drew back the blinds a little, and Margaret Ursula was awake again. "I suppose," said Margaret Ursula at breakfast, "that is quite true, that kind words are worth more than gold." "Far more," said the aunt. "It's just as well," said Margaret Ursula, meditatively, "that most people don't know that." "But why?" "Well, nobody would ever say anything nice to you." "Occasionally," said the aunt severely. "You say things that surprise me, Margaret Ursula." End of section 33.
Section 34 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria de Fátima da Silva. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. The Worthless Stones. The 2 men who had been eagerly studying the lists of situations vacant in the newspapers of the free reading room came out dejected. They wore frock coats and silk hats and patent leather boots, all in the last stage of decay. "May as well go and sit in the park," suggested the elder. "It's as good as anything else or as bad," assented the younger. I'll tell you what it is, Smithson, said the old man, as he took his seat in the sun and gazed reflectively into the interior of his silk hat. We ought to have seen this coming. We ought to have been prepared for it. We ought to have had something else up our sleeve. As it is, said the younger man, we are absolutely at the end of everything. I haven't got a penny in my pockets. I suppose you haven't either, Marks. No, said Marks. I've got a paper of Brazilian diamonds of the first water, and I've got a nice little lot of pigeon's blood rubies. A year ago I could have got about 14,000 for them. Today, if I offered them in exchange for a penny loaf, the man would laugh at me. Yes, Smithson, we ought to have seen this coming. I don't know about that, said Smithson. Nobody else saw it. Why should they? Ever since the beginning of the world, precious stones, as they used to be called, had been held in high esteem. It was so in all nations and all ages. What reason had we to expect this sudden change of fashion, this sudden awakening to the facts, if you like to put it that way? Because, said Marks, we might have argued it out. We might have said to ourselves that the game had been good for a very long time, and that was all the more reason why it should not last much longer. If we had just put to ourselves the plain question, why are precious stones precious? We should have made provision for the bursting of the bubble. They were only precious because a lot of fools, principally women, chose to think they were. It was purely arbitrary. There was nothing else in it at all. As civilization went on, people were bound to wake up to the fact. When one recalls that not so many years ago any amount of capital and labor was being expended in South Africa and elsewhere in order to get some brilliant rubbish out of the ground for women to stick in their hair or to put around their necks, why, it simply seems like a mad dream. It's much more wonderful that the humbug lasted so long than that it stopped when it did. Smithson drew from his waistcoat pocket 3 or 4 beautiful pearls, spread them on the palm of his hand, and looked at them. I still think, you know, he said, that there's a kind of charm about these things. Of course, I know that they're no longer worth anything, but still, I've got a liking for them. Simply a remnant of your old prejudice, said Marks. The glass workers turn out much prettier things. They get more variety of color and of pattern. All the endless worry with banks and safes is done away with. If a woman loses a few of her beads, she can easily go to the nearest shop and buy another 6-penny worth. If in the old days she had lost a few pearls like those that you have in your hand, there would have been no end of a hullabaloo. Columns and columns in the paper about it. It was not to my interests, of course, that this change should come. It has ruined men like you and me, but it has done a lot of good as well. Think of the amount of crime there used to be. Heaps of burglars in London not so long ago would have risked their freedom for the rest of their lives, and perhaps their necks as well, to have stolen the rubies that I have got in my inside pocket. Women were bought and sold for those toys. Nations kept vast amounts of capital locked up and unproductive in the form of crown jewels. It was a rotten system, and on the whole it's a good thing that we've done with it. All I say is, we ought to have seen the end was coming. Look here, Marks, said Smithson sharply. Don't say that any more, please. See, it gets on my nerves. When a man has made an almighty fool of himself and is suffering for it in consequence, it doesn't improve his temper to have somebody keep on telling him that he might have foreseen what would happen. I'm going to give up thinking about it altogether. The spring's coming on now, and gardeners will be wanted. I always had a little taste that way, luckily, and I may be able to find a job yet. Ah, said Marks, you are a younger man than I am. I don't know what's going to happen to me." Absent-mindedly, he drew from his pocket his paper of Brazilian diamonds and scattered them broadcast. A few sparrows fluttered down and went away disappointed. A stern park keeper came up. "Look here," he said sharply. "I can't have that mess made all over these gravel paths. I've a jolly good mind to make you pick 'em all up again. You'd better clear out, you two, and look slippy about it." End of section 34. Section 35 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria de Fátima da Silva. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. Gold. There was once in the Dark Ages a boy of great ambition and solid worth. He did not play the fool and vex his teachers. He was kind to cats. He did not even annoy his papa and mamma. When other boys were playing at tournaments, damaging their clothes, and sometimes losing their tempers, he never joined them. He sat patiently at home studying the signs of the zodiac and the virtues of herbs and simples. He was devoted to study. His brain developed rapidly. At the age of 12, he had a forehead like the Albert Hall. This made other boys so jealous that they threw things at him, but he did not care because he knew he was doing right. He had great ideas. On the whitewashed wall of his little bedroom, he wrote in large letters, "Concentration." I may observe in passing that in the Dark Ages spelling was more a matter of individual taste than it is now. His father saw what his little son had done and took the necessary steps, but he could not help feeling he was spanking a boy with a future. The father was but a poor armourer and suffering severely from the competition of a big cut-price establishment that had just started in the same street. But he managed to scrape together enough money to apprentice his son to an astrologer and general alchemist. The astrologer said frequently and emphatically that he had never had a better or more studious apprentice. Time passed, and our young friend was no longer a boy. He was a youth, and moreover, he was a youth whose roomy cranium and established character for steadiness attracted the attention of the maidens of the district. Girls then were very much as they are now. They would have nothing to say to youths with a certain amount of devil in them, however handsome or however wealthy they might be. What they liked was moral worth and plenty of forehead. So they threw shy glances at our young philosopher, and they asked him to tea. Likewise, they suggested that he should take part in some amateur theatricals. Further, they said Papa would be so glad if he would come over and smoke a pipe with him one night. But the young man would have none of it. Other apprentices suggested that he should take part in games where, although skill may have been present, chance largely preponderated. But he remained firm. He would not make love. He would not play cards. He would not come out and have a drink. He was wholly devoted to his work. He managed to scrape up enough money, scraping ran a good deal in the family, to take 12 lessons in the art of transmuting the baser metals into gold. It was true that the teacher had not yet discovered the secret himself, but there was always a possibility of some useful hints. Nowadays, the guides to success in journalism, finance, and matrimony are almost invariably written by the people who have not attained it. the world has really changed very little. It must not be supposed that the young man's devotion to the study of the great secret prevented him from close attention to his ordinary business. During the whole time of his apprenticeship, he made only one mistake. At the end of his apprenticeship, his master offered him, and he accepted, the post of head of the horoscope department, and still every moment of leisure was given to study. He heard the music, he heard the dance go on, but for him there was to be no rest and no amusement until he had found the secret which would transmute the baser metals into gold. His brain development had now progressed to such an extent that his hats had to be specially built for him. Years passed away and his master died. On his deathbed he called the studious head of the horoscope department to him and imparted the great secret. Our philosopher, now very middle-aged, went straight off to the kitchen to test it and found that it did not work. He countermanded the order for a wreath of everlastings with Miss Pa on it and refused to attend the funeral. After he had been middle-aged for a long period, he became old. Really, in some respects, the world has not changed one little bit. He had never had any love, he had never had any fun, and he had not got the secret. It was very dull, but one must admire his strength of purpose. He went on. The secret came at last when he was a toothless dodgerer, and it came by accident. He sat before his furnace with a biscuit tin, which he had just converted into 22-carat gold. With great care he wrote out the long and elaborate formula. Then he thought about it. If he had never discovered the secret, it would always have been worth discovering. But now what could it do for him? Pleasure was a closed book, and he had no wants that he had not ample means to satisfy. The discovery had merely stopped his work and spoiled his life. He flung the formula into the furnace, and his secret died with him. If this simple story leads any reader to the conviction that the only things worth having are the things we have not got, it will not have been written in vain. End of section 35.
Section 36 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mitzi. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. The Pig and the Jacoby. The garden of the villa was tended by a man once a week, and to some extent by the 3 daughters of the house. They were large, healthy girls who liked tennis, easy jokes, occasional tea parties, and church on Sundays. None of them was plain, and the youngest was as near as nothing engaged to the curate. This tells you, or ought to tell you, exactly what kind of a garden it was. You know, for instance, the bed cut out on the smaller lawn between the front of the house and the road. You are aware that by this time it is decently filled with a Jacoby geranium. You know that the bed is edged with blue lobelia or with pyrethrum, and that after all, it does not much matter which. You can hear Agnes laughing in a strong voice of no musical quality at the back of the house, because her sister Lillian, in running back for a ball on the smooth-shaven tennis lawn, has skidded and fallen humorously. You can hear Lillian's retort of, "You are a beast," words which she would not have used if the curate had been present. But you do not know what those patient geraniums in their deadly rows thought about it, and other things. Therefore, listen. As a matter of fact,
said the plant, which was rather taller than the rest. "We are quite beautiful." "That's no use," said a miserable starveling. The starveling was quite the smallest of the Jacoby geraniums. It never ought to have been sent out at all. The family had complained about it. "And may I ask why?" said the tall Jacoby. "Because we are so appallingly common," said the starveling. "It seems to me that it saddens the warm onset of summer to think how many Jacobys just like us are at this time being bedded out in gardens just like this." "Undoubtedly," said the tall geranium, "we pay the price for popularity. It would certainly be well if only the better grown specimens were used." "Thanks," sneered the starveling. "I meant nothing personal. There are too many of us, I admit it. But surely our popularity is proof positive of our beauty. It is a comfort. It gives us confidence. It enables us to say that we are beautiful without either vanity or mock humility, without expressing our own opinion, but referring to the concentrated wisdom of generations of a higher race. The concentrated wisdom of 70,000 suburban red brick clerk boxes with a small strip of ground in front made to look like a jam tart and called a garden, and with a tennis lawn for Agnes, Ethel, and Lillian. Another scream. I gather that that poor, long-legged child has gone over once more. I can understand why you personally should be embittered. For myself, I can look at the exquisite color of my leaves and the sanguine glory of my... The telegraph boy who had called earlier in the morning had left the front gate open. An improper action, but common to all telegraph boys. A remarkably fat pig who had escaped from somewhere, with no other motive than a vague desire to get somewhere else, strayed into the garden. It thrust what it confidently believed to be a loving smile, though it did not look it, into the middle of the geranium bed. "Well, my little friends," said the pig, "and what were you talking about?" "Put crudely," said the tall geranium, "it sounds a little vain. We were complaining of our excessive popularity, due no doubt to our remarkable beauty, but having a distinct tendency to lower us in the eyes of the fastidious and eclectic." "What beautiful words you do use," said the pig, with a sigh that the superficial observer might have mistaken for a grunt. "With that, I had some of your despised popularity. Men give me nothing but foul food, and grumble that I am a foul feeder. They keep me in the dirtiest places, and complain that I am not nice in my habits. My very name has become a term of reproach and contempt. And yet I go on." "And it all ends in dead leaves," said the starveling. The pig shook his head. "It ends, I believe, in ham." "We all have our cross to bear," said the tall Jacoby, who, like all vain people, had a streak of sentimentality in her disposition. "Here am I, a well-grown specimen of a beautiful plant. I know it, but I cannot be happy because I am conscious of commonness. Better the outcast that is rare than the cherished beauty that is common. Here I must sit and suffer through the long summer months until the frosts come." "Must?" said the pig. "Absolutely must," said the Jacoby. "Not at all," said the pig. A few moments passed. Lillian came round from the back of the house in search of a lost tennis ball. She saw the pig and screamed to Ethel. Ethel screamed to Agnes. Agnes screamed because it was her habit. Then, armed with rackets, they descended upon that pig. He went out of the garden in an awkward, untidy trot, complaining bitterly of injustice. They chevied him a little way down the road, met the curate, and were much ashamed. He walked back with them to the house. "Dear, dear," said the curate in his refined, clerical voice, as he stood by the bed of Jacoby's. "That pig has destroyed one of your best geraniums." End of section 36.
Section 37 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. The Wrong Elixir. In the days when science was more poetical and less scientific than it is now, there lived a certain alchemist. He was an old man. His feet shuffled and his knees dotted as he walked. He had the gray and hairy face of a sick monkey. His knowledge was so profound that he was generally respected, and his temper was so abominable that he was intensely unpopular. Therefore, when on a fine morning in May, he came down to breakfast with an expression approaching complacence, and entirely omitted to curse the cook, his universal procedure before taking food. His wife and family were surprised and a little nervous. It was so unlike him. His wife asked him if he were unwell. He only answered the question, though on principle he never answered his wife's questions, and usually affected not to have heard her speak, but even added a "thank you" to his "no." She was the more distressed, and he noticed it. He never thanked anybody. It portended something serious. "The fact is," he said, "that the studies of a lifetime culminated last night in a discovery which I believed to be of importance. Hence my unusual hilarity." Hilarity was perhaps a strong word for it. Yet even a great and tumultuous joy would have been comprehensible, considering the nature of his discovery. "Is it the Philosopher's Stone?" his wife asked. But he was in no mood to overdo his vein of gracious light-heartedness. He stared at her stonily, as if she were something in a bottle which he had already analyzed. Then he shuffled out towards his laboratory. It was not the Philosopher's Stone. It was, if possible, an even greater discovery. For in the elixir which that very night he meant to taste, he held the secret of eternal life. Eternal life was in these dark ages considered desirable by quite a number of people. He did not propose to communicate his secret to any of his fellows. It has to be for himself alone. They would go, and he would remain, growing slowly into the wonder of the whole world. There were even indications in his researches that made it seem probable that with the unlimited years of his life there would be an accession of youth. His hair would grow again, and he would get new teeth, and perhaps learn once more the meaning of the word romance. Emperors would come from the East to look upon him, the one man in the world who held the secret. In the meantime he was not disposed to be idle. His ordinary avocations called him. A gypsy-faced slut of a girl had come to him with gold pieces, got the devil knows how. The alchemist did not inquire. He tested the gold and found it true. "And for this?" he asked. "There is a man," she said in a tired, uninterested way, "who has got to die. I need a very swift poison, and one that leaves no trace of poison in the body." "Painless?" he inquired. She shrugged her shoulders. "It is of no importance," she said. He begged her to come to him again in 3 days. He was a man of vast experience, and had no trouble in satisfying the simple needs of the gypsy girl. He took one drug here and another there. He blended and cooked and strained. When he had finished, he had a pale green liquor with neither taste nor smell. A drop of it would have killed an elephant, and a gallon of it would have defied the best of our modern chemists. It was of the same color as the elixir of life, which he himself was to drink that evening, and, of course, he made the usual mistake. Possibly he had primed himself with strong waters to give him courage for his experiment, and the courage had been bought at the expense of clear-headedness. At any rate, he reached his hand to the wrong glass, and in a moment it was all over. He had drunk the poison that he had intended for the gypsy girl's faithless lover. He lay, an untidy lump of clay-colored, worn-out humanity, on the studio floor, with a fixed grin on his face that would have frightened people. His wife found him there in the morning and wept bitterly, and was sincerely sorry that she would never hear him curse the cook again. There was a glass filled with a greenish fluid, and this she threw away, not knowing that she had lost here the discovery that had never been made till then and will never be made again. It seemed to her safer. The gypsy girl was annoyed, but said nothing. She had enough money left to buy herself a knife, and she got into serious trouble over it. That he took the poison was undoubted. That he took the wrong elixir is a point on which I should like to have the dead man's opinion. End of section 37.
Section 38 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. Section 38. Evolution. An elderly ape perched himself comfortably high up on a tree of the forest. He was taking a rest cure, and he had a large bunch of bananas by his side for purposes of reference. When his twinkling eyes looked downwards into the heart of the forest, it was as if he had looked into the night. Something moved in the darkness below him and tapped politely with a stone on the trunk of the tree. "Are you at home, uncle?" called out a voice from below. "You may come up," said the elderly ape without enthusiasm. He groaned in spirit. This young nephew of his was a jabberer and a general nuisance, and had views. It was certain that if he came up he would talk, and talk to that elderly ape was nearly as bad as work. Now perfect rest and bananas, as near perfection as he could get them, were the things that at his time of life he particularly desired. "I thought I'd just look in as I was passing, uncle," said the younger ape. "I'm afraid I'm interrupting you at your luncheon?" "You are interrupting me at my breakfast, which is a shade worse." "Sorry. I see you've got plenty of first-rate bananas there." "Then you see wrong," said the uncle. "They are second-rate. I've eaten 6 of them, and I ought to know. And I've not got plenty. I have only got just enough for one." "I didn't mean to suggest anything," said the young ape nervously. "A nephew who suggests that he wants my bananas intentionally is impertinent, but shows sense. A nephew who makes the same suggestion without intention is just as impertinent, and is a blundering fool besides. Kindly peel that banana for me. I'm tired this morning and not up to much work." "With pleasure," said the nephew effusively. "I suppose you've heard of the great news in the scientific world." "What is it?" asked the uncle. "And be a little bit quicker with that banana. Laziness is the curse of all you young apes." "The discovery is called evolution." "Then I don't believe in it," said the uncle. "But you don't know what it is." "That," said the uncle majestically, "is immaterial. I disbelieve it just the same. I disbelieve it on the sound of it. How's your mother this morning?" "Mamma is a little upset. One coconut too many last night, she seems to think." "I do not profess to understand the arguments in favor of evolution myself, but the main conclusions which I hear are generally accepted are that the different forms of animal life sprang from one original form, some kind of fish, I believe. We, of course, stand at the top of the scale, and we were evolved from man." "Is this the kind of thing that your parents gave you a pious education for?" asked the uncle sternly. "Well," said the young ape, "I always try to keep abreast of modern thought. When new facts spring up and they are proved, you've got to believe in them." "You may have," said his uncle contemptuously. "I, on the other hand, have not. I saw you only the other day with a chimpanzee of known bad character. I have no doubt that it is his influence which makes you talk in this ribald and blasphemous way." "Not at all," said the nephew. "I had no wish to be ribald. What I say is that you must face facts. An ape has been discovered in some parts of Europe wearing clothes like a man, using a knife and fork like a man, and sleeping in a bed like a man. Then he should be sequestrated, said the uncle, if not worse, he added thoughtfully. Then again, the nephew urged, there is the anatomical argument. The shape of the skull of a man is different from that of an ape. It is not so highly developed. Now the shape of my skull, the shape of your skull, said the elderly uncle, will undergo some material alteration in a minute if you insist on talking this nonsense. I tell you that man could never, under the most favorable conditions, develop into an ape. We are as far above him as the stars above the trees. Do you mean to tell me that this tree could evolve into a fixed planet? Of course not, said the nephew nervously. My argument is, peel me another banana, said the uncle, and don't argue. You never hear me argue. I tell people things. I say that they are so. That is enough. There is no necessity to go beyond that. Now go home and try to live a better and cleaner life in future. And if I ever hear that word evolution from you again, I will knock a considerable hole in your face. All I wanted to urge, get down the tree, roared the uncle, and the nephew obeyed promptly. As he slithered and scrambled down, his uncle threw banana skins at him and hit him every time. After that, he gave a sigh of content and resumed the rest cure. End of section 38.
Section 39 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. Blue Roses. There were once blue roses. It was long and long ago, and even then the blue roses were very scarce. There was but one bush growing in a wood near to a royal palace, and until the flowers were in bloom, it looked exactly like an ordinary wild rose. But children playing in the wood in June had come upon it and spread the story so that many went out to see the blue roses, and strange stories were told of the power that they had. In the royal palace there lived a princess who distinguished herself from the princesses of romance by not being at all beautiful. This was the harder upon her because she was a woman who herself worshipped beauty wherever she saw it and of whatever kind it might be. When she was told that a marriage had been arranged and would shortly take place between herself and a prince from a neighboring country whom she had never seen, she shrugged her shoulders and acquiesced. These things were a matter of state. She would never love the prince, and her mirror told her that he would never love her, but the succession would be secured. Now, as it chanced, this prince, though not otherwise notable, was an extremely beautiful young man, and fully conscious of it. He spent much time and trouble on his dress and his adornment. He looked like the very picture of a prince always. He also had recognized that the marriage was one of interest and expediency, and when he saw the little plain woman who was to be his wife, he was quite polite and fascinating in his manners. He did not grumble. He was not recalcitrant. At the same time, he was not in the least in love with her. This was entirely as she had expected. The really serious trouble was that she fell very much in love with him, so much so that she annoyed the king, her father, and the ministers on whose counsel he relied by saying that, come what might, even if she never married at all, she should not marry this prince. "What have you against him?" the king asked. The princess laughed. pressed further, she would only repeat with obstinacy that she would not marry him. The natural effect of this was to make everybody extremely disagreeable to her. All who had the right, and some who had not, spoke at large on the subject of duty. So the princess kept out of the way, in her own apartments, or wandering in the wood by the palace. And sometimes she wept, and sometimes she painted from memory a portrait of the prince who loved her not. For a princess, she painted rather well. One day, as she sat in her apartments, she heard a young page beneath the window speaking to his fellows, and saying that as he passed through the wood, he had seen the blue roses. Then the stories that she had heard of them came back to her mind, and all unattended she went out into the wood. Long was her search, but it was rewarded in the end. Deep in a shadowed place, far from the track, she saw the intense blue of the strange roses, and at the foot of the bush she sat and rested and thought for a while. Then, timorously, she plucked the petals from one of the roses and ate them, and their taste seemed to be at first sweet, and afterwards very bitter. Having done this, she lay down at full length, waiting to see whether the strange story of the blue roses was true, or whether perhaps the petals might be poisonous, or whether they might have no power at all over her. And very soon she slept. In her sleep she was still herself, but she had become very beautiful, so that it was a delight to her to see her own face in a mirror or in a clear stream. And she knew that on the morrow she was to wed the prince. And he came to her with love in his eyes, love in his words, so that for the first time she knew what it was to be ignorant, whether to yield or to resist. As he kissed her, she awoke again. Now the sunlight had found out the corner where she lay, and shone hot upon her. The blue roses had done their work, and she had known love. Then she thought to herself of the bitterness of going on for the rest of her life without it, and she took out her dagger and cut down that rose bush and tore out the roots of it, that no one else might suffer as she suffered. After that, she lived for quite a long time, rather bad-tempered and slightly addicted to good works, but the blue roses are happily lost to us. End of section 39. Recording by M.L. Wize.
Section 40 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Angelique Campbell, August 2018. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. The Street of Peril. There was in the old days a king who had a very beautiful daughter. It is to be remarked that in the old days all the kings had very beautiful daughters. This should form the subject of a royal commission. As I was just going to say, when I started to think about something else, the name of the very beautiful daughter of this king was the Princess Caramel. Her father adored her and had the highest possible opinion of her. It is quite possible to adore people without having any opinion of them at all. But the king did not do this. He considered the Princess Caramel to be the perfect woman. He wondered how he was to find any man who would be half good enough to marry her. The thought of this used to keep him awake at night. He would say to his courtiers, "The Princess Caramel has the most superb beauty, but she also has the highest ability and the finest character." And then the courtiers would yawn and say, They had noticed it themselves. The trouble that the kings of fable had in selecting husbands for their very beautiful daughters should engage the attention of the Psychical Research Society. One day the king entered the apartments of the Princess Caramel, and spake as follows. My dearest child, lying awake upon my bed, I devised a test by which I might tell if any man were fit to have the high honor of being your husband. I have now under process of construction a street which shall be called the Street of Peril. It will be 1 mile in length, and it will contain all the temptations of which the professors of iniquity can bethink themselves. The man who can make the passage of that street in anything under 20 minutes will be as gold that has been tried in the furnace. He shall be your husband. Thanks so much, papa, said the princess, but privily she took her own dispositions. So the street was built and furnished. It was full of allurement and perfume. Delirious and gambling games went on there, and the aspirant had to pass the tables of poker and orchun and snooker. There were also musicians with pipe and tabor. The difference between a tabor and tambourine is not worth mentioning. There were dancing girls of surpassing beauty and excessive amiability. There were tables spread with the richest and most enticing banquets, and, be it noted, the young aspirant had to enter the street fasting. Precisely at 8 o'clock in the evening, the aspirant entered the Street of Peril. At the other end of the street waited the king with his stopwatch in his hand, and the band of the striped Hungarians. When, as always happened, at the end of 20 minutes, the aspirant had not appeared, and telephoned that he was detained by a fog in the city, the band of the striped Hungarians would play the melody of a song which was to the effect that there was another good man who had gone wrong. The Street of Peril became popular. To show oneself worthy of the Princess Caramel became a synonym for moral degradation, just as I apply for the Chiltern Hundreds means, can I have a peerage, please? At the end of 10 years, no one had succeeded in making the passage of the Street of Peril in the prescribed time, and the king, who was not so young as he had formerly been, fell very sick. As he lay a-dying, he called his daughter to him. Caramel, I have done you a great and grievous wrong. I have required perfection for you, and there is no perfection in this world. Therefore my shy wild rose has been left to fade upon her stem, so to speak. I'll look all right by artificial light, said the princess modestly. While I searched in vain for perfection, your life was left without joy or savour, ascetic and cloistral. Not entirely, dear papa. How mean you? Well, when you told me that you had devised this Street of Peril by bribery and corruption, I arranged certain matters with the professors of iniquity, and, not to put too fine a point upon it, for the last 10 years I have been one of the temptations. The king died immediately. End of section 40. Recording by Angelique Campbell, August 2018.
Section 41 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. The Curate, the Boy, and the Bee. The bee lay dead on the gravel path just outside the patent hive. The curate, who never missed the chance of an object lesson, called attention to it. See, he said to the boy whom it was his pleasure and duty to instruct, Here lies this poor little insect, its life work done, its task accomplished. The boy looked at it stolidly. He was a bullet-headed boy, with spectacles, and a nasty German habit of taking nothing for granted. "Yes," said the boy. "In a garden there's a lot of that kind of thing about. A bit further up the path there is a black slug. I pulped his head with my heel as we passed. So his life's work's done, and his task accomplished. There's a dead chrysanthemum. More life work and task as per schedule." "Gently, George," said the curate. "Gently. You are going on too fast. Your analogies are incorrect. The slug does harm. The bee does good. The chrysanthemum has never worked. The bee is always busy. You may remember how this fact impressed the great Watts. He noticed how the little busy bee improved each shining hour, and gathered honey all the day from every— "Half speed astern," said the boy. "Steady your horses. Put in the reverse. That somewhat spavined argument ought not to be worked any longer. All the slug cares for is to get something to eat, and that is all the bee cares for. The fact that, unless some thoughtful boy happens to pulp their heads, slugs feed on strawberries and lettuces, does not affect the argument. Bees would feed on strawberries and lettuces if they did not prefer honey." "One moment," said the curate, triumphant. "Answer me this question. Does the slug exercise foresight? Does the slug lay up a store of honey for itself?" "No," said the boy. "The slug does not lay up a store of honey. Neither does it lay up a store of dog biscuits. Neither does it lay up a store of anything else. The reason is simple. There is always food for it. If it went into the warehouse business like the bee, it would show not foresight, but extreme folly." "You must admit, at any rate, that the bee shows extreme wisdom. Could you build one of those waxen cells?" "I hate cells anyhow," said the boy. "That is why I cannot consent to have the wisdom of the bee played upon me. It's fool enough to get into a patent hive, and sweat out its life at filling up sections with honey, which sections it will never keep, since they will be taken out of the hive and sold for a shilling apiece, or more if you have luck. The bee has no wish to benefit humanity at all. When humanity sneaks the honey, it has to wear a veil and thick gloves. The bee merely benefits humanity by being a stupendous idiot." "Hush," said the curate. "Men far better and wiser than you are, or perhaps ever will be, have admired the wisdom and industry of the bee." He picked up the dead insect and laid it on the palm of his fat hand. "I am humble enough to say that I wish that I myself were more like this little insect." "But you are," said the boy. "Exactly like it." "I fear not," said the curate, with a gratified smile. "I try to do my work, but every now and then there are hours of laziness which— "I don't mean that at all," said the boy. "What you haven't noticed is that this particular bee happens to be a drone. Now let's go and play tennis." End of section 41. Section 42 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. George. "He is a remarkably plain young man," she wrote in her diary the first day she met him. "He has rather an interesting face," she said to her mamma a month later, as she decked her apricot-colored tea gown with the William Allen Richardsons that he had just sent her. When she wrote to her best friend to give the news of her engagement, she expressed herself thus: "He has not the regular featured dollish good looks which I have always hated in men. He has a strong, characterful face and magnificent eyes." "You loveliest one," she sighed, as she poured out his tea at the third breakfast of the honeymoon. "I could sit and look at you forever." 6 months later, when the other man had come along, she observed to her husband, "I don't know whether you're aware of it, George, but your hair's getting most frightfully thin on the top, and you're just about the last man in the universe that can afford to go bald." A man's looks must not be judged by appearances. End of section 42. Recording by phone. Section 43 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. Pull the Right String. The great man had a well-salaried berth at his disposal. It was a comfortable berth. The man who got it was likely to go short of nothing except work. Jones had really deserved it. The great man, in considering Jones's application, admitted to himself that the claim was well-founded. Brown's testimonials were magnificent, and he sent them in. The great man said that he had never seen better testimonials. Smith had no testimonials, had deserved nothing, and was otherwise unsuitable. But Smith had a little talk with the great man's wife. Smith got that berth. My poor friends, it is not politeness to the paying cashier which will arrange the overdraft. Go straight for the inner office. End of section 43. Recording by phone. Section 44 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. Too much self-help. The editor, having come to the conclusion that his paper needed to be livened up, put on his hat and went round to the employment agency. "Good morning, Mr. Agency," he said. "I want you to find me a young man who can write really smart paragraphs." "Thank you," said Mr. Agency as he booked the order. "We've got 480 of them on our books. I'll send a few dozen of the best round to your office this afternoon, and you can pick one. That do?" "Nicely," said the editor, and rose to go, when he remembered something. "By the way," he said, "I also want a boy who can be trusted to take charge of the stamps and petty cash." Then Mr. Agency threw down his pen. He did not book that order. He gave a sigh like a high-power suction pump. "Do you?" he said in a melancholy voice. "Well, if you find two, save one for me. I want one myself." Oh, my poor friends who are trying to be cleverer than you are, remember that the world also wants honest men. And, as things stand at present, patent tills with the unmonkeyable lock are a better market than brain fertilizers containing free phosphorus. End of section 44. Recording by phone.
Section 45 of Stories Without Tears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne. Not impervious to damp. The pretty suffragette made a long, convincing speech, filled with historical allusions, a quart of best mixed statistics, and a nice peroration, all made to wind up. A report of that speech appeared in a daily paper, which had been disappointed of a company prospectus, and consequently had space to fill. Mr. Average came home from the city, read that daily paper till he came to the report of that speech, and nearly went past Surbiton, which is where he lives. A few days later, the pretty suffragette, accompanied by friends, went out to make trouble. They made it. The pretty suffragette managed to create a riot, and slapped a good-tempered, mutton-fed policeman on the nose. "And she'd jolly well get 6 months hard for that if I were the magistrate," growled Mr. Average. And then the pretty suffragette, pleading in court in her defense, broke down and wept bitterly. As a matter of fact, she was a woman. Mr. Average read all about it and was conscious of a sense of discomfort. "Oh, take and give her the silly old vote if she wants it," he said, feeling vaguely ashamed. Pause before you smile at Mr. Average. The strictly logical mind is one of the few things in this world that cannot be produced by chemistry out of coal tar. Inconsistency does not necessarily hurt. The British Constitution is founded on it. End of section 45. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. End of Stories Without Tears by Barry Payne.